Today's date, the 17th of March, 2024, I am with the distinguished former Prime Minister and former Cabinet Minister of the government of the Commonwealth of Dominica. Before that, the Associated State of Britain of Dominica, Oliver J. Seraphine. And we called him in those days OJ. Good afternoon, Mrs. Seraphine. How are you, sir?
It's a pleasure to be talking with you, and I'm in very good spirits. I'm very happy to reconnect with you. Having known your parents very well, I was an insurance agent for your mother at one time, and there it was. We had a good relationship. I think you're one of the youth leaders of the party that I led, Democratic Labour Party. And
that's indeed true.
You've done what you had to do as an activist and someone who have done us proud, living humble families like you did. In fact, I was the insurance sales manager for your uncles. I mean, Mr. Christian of the Christian musical class fame.
Lemuel Macpherson Christian.
Lemuel, quite a personality. What a gentleman he was. Yes, in fact, I'll just share that with you quickly before I forget it. I recall, when he went up living somewhere by the Anglican Church, I visited him then, and his wife had just passed. She came from the indigenous people, as you know.
Yes, Cecilia Williams, there's a Cecilia Christian. We call her anti-Arab. She was a full-blooded Kalinago.
Yeah, full-blooded and quite a personality.
In fact, she was the first Kalinago to play the cello and to play classical music in Dominican history.
Yes, there we go. And one time he had a moment of sentiment, and he shared it with me. And he says, Mr. Seraphine, I don't tell people my business, but would you believe that I actually have my wife's blouse or something of that sort underneath my pillow? And that keeps me comfort at night after she had gone.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. He was the one uncle who raised my dad. The first Christian family, their mom passed in 1924, I believe, when my father was about 3 years old. So someone with H.L. Christian, that's H.L. Christian, Henkel Lockenbach Christian, who was your cabinet colleague, more on him later. And others went with L.M. Christian. But in the 1930s, they had the Christian family orchestra. And they played classical music. My dad played the mandolin. L.M. played about 6 instruments, including the guitar and the violin. H.L. played the violin. But L.M. raised my father. So we would go to the studio. As you know, he had a musical studio on Sunday afternoons after church on the way home. That's the first place I ate Ritz crackers was at his home. The same Cecilia Christian, his wife, and the Arab, the Kalinago Celis. She would bring us, a little tray with Fanta, Juicy, 7-Up, and Ritz crackers. Today, I'm told that we do not have any soda factories in Dominica, but that's another question.
That is something else, because you have Tri-Hills, of course, the Tavernier people, with this particular venture there on the street going to the riverside. Very, very good family they were, and they produced that. And in fact, it was very close to where I lived. There was Bob's Dyer living next door, and there was Tri-Hills. So we were able to get our Juicy, or whatever they call it. Tri-Hills, actually, it was what it's called.
Well, there's Tri-Hills, but there's also, at some point in time in Pong, something called KB Cola.
What's it called?
KB Cola in Pong.
Yeah, okay, all right.
Right off Bath Road.
Right.
Some people have said to me it was KC Cola, but I remember it as KB. And we would go to the guy and ask for rejects. Because, there were sweet drinks. So after your bottle was empty, you'd bring back the crate. But because it was a sweet drink, insects would go inside the bottle sometimes, and they would have to wash it out, but not always properly. And so if he saw anything dancing inside of the thing, he'd put it on the side as a reject. It would pass on the conveyor belt in front of a lamp. And if he saw anything dancing, he'd put it on the side. And we're at the Rosa Mix Infant School. Now, when you're a child, you're a child in a state of nature is a barbarian. We'd go to the place and ask for rejects, and we'd drink the soft drink through the end of our shirt. And so our shirts now with a strainer. We'd put it through our shirt and drink it through our shirt.
Wow, that's a good memory. What I remember about that, I will just close on that one, was going to a celebration in Salisbury where this lady had one bottle of juicy, and there were about 8 or 10 children, and they had this little short glass, that the older people used to have, and that
Yes.
went around, and that was like nectar. Even as we speak, I feel the taste of it.
Those were the days, my friend, when one
Yeah.
can of sardine would feed a family of eight. Our parents had to learn the art of home economics, where they would have scarcity would not be an impediment. But let's get to your life, Prime Minister. When were you born and where were you born?
Well, I was born in Roseau on the 2nd of August of 1943. I'm not exactly a spring chicken anymore, but I was one of those victims, if that was such a word. But that was my
Yes.
nurturing ground, however, and got me very excited and passionate about the cause of the less fortunate. Because I grew in Old Street, New Street, Fort Lane, the Bathurst State area, Virgin Lane, and River Street. So we made the rounds. And it was not until Frank Barron came in that the self-help aided um, buildings for houses took place. That's at
And
Slimford
that
Crescent and
project
Griffin Road.
was to take care of the poor, was to remove the poor quality of housing that was then commonplace.
Well, exactly. So I came from that, and I ended up with the Sheridan. Gregor was my neighbor next door, his sister Sharita, and
Yeah.
we grew up in
And
that
by the way, the
area.
picture that I just showed was a picture at your heights. That's when you were prime minister in 1979.
I agree. I was just adding that there was a possibility of it having been a picture taken at a specific event, which I
Yeah.
believe could have been the um, Miami Conference of the Caribbean, when you had leaders like Andrew Young was present there, and of course Sally Shelton was there present, and other important leaders from Jamaica, Barbados, etc., were present. And I remember making a speech. I was accompanied by Julian Johnson, and that speech seemed to have touched the vein, and I was declared one of those persons, like like a new breath of air, a young man coming in and expressing opinions about the lack of services and benefits from the Europeans or the Americans and so on. And that speech seemed to have connected very well. In fact, most of what that speech was saying later on became a major frontier of involvement of the Americas in terms of the concept being by Reagan of the connections between the United States and the Caribbean. A
You're
lot
talking
of
about
what I said,
The Caribbean Basin
the
Initiative,
Caribbean
CBI.
Basin Initiative, the CBI, a
So when
little
we
bit
say
of
CBI, we don't mean selling of passports. We're talking about trade.
that's correct. It was trade is
Yes.
supposed to be given certain benefits as it pertains to taxation benefits and other such who
Yes.
would have been given to, which would have been given to those persons who would dare to come in the Caribbean and venture into a new form of investment. And
Yes.
Reagan came up with that idea. I don't think it caught root though, because it didn't take too long before it disappeared as a
Yeah.
conscious connection between the Americans and ourselves.
Yeah. But let's get back to your parents. So you're born in 1943. Who was your father and who was your mother?
My father was Perry Seraphine. He was one who became a tailor, having been trained by Julian Johnson's, who of cabinet secretary fame and whatever else, ambassadorships and stuff. His father taught my father
So
the art
Julian
of
Johnson's
tailoring.
father taught your father.
Yes, that's correct. And my father then became a principal tailor for the police services and fire services as well. He prepared he did their clothes, their uniforms, and he also was responsible for taking care of whatever details that they needed for their uniforms to be maintained. At that time, it was by the Fort Young Hotel. That's when the police department
Yeah.
was.
For
And
those
where
of you who will be listening to this tape, what the Prime Minister is saying is that police headquarters was at what is now called the Fort Young Hotel, but it was then called simply Fort Young, or as a child, we just say the fort. Go on.
That's correct. And of course, the fire services was exactly where the museum is on the waterfront. And
Yes.
so I recall as a boy having to be going there to bring uniforms for different persons who work there. So that's the beginning. My mother was an entrepreneur. She first started
What was your
having
mother's name?
my mother's name was Theotile Seraphine. She came originally from the Grand Fort area. She came from Grand Fort and
And
came
your
to the
father, where
city.
did your father come
My
from?
father was Kulibistri by mother and Soufriere, at the southern tip of Dominica there. And because that's where the Seraphines come from. And we had linkages with Good Hope. My mother's father came from Delices and was related to the Sorrentos and persons like that in that particular area. So we have linkages of the east, the west coast, and of course, all the way to the south of Dominica.
Yeah. When was your father born? Do you remember his date of birth and his date of death?
Not off my head, but he died when he was about 85 years old, and he was a quintessential gentleman, highly respected, old school. In fact, he's one of the few people who remain, I recall, tipping the hat when he passed someone of consequence on the streets. And he became very close to the leaders of the Labour Party. He was very close to E.C. Black. He was also highly connected with E.O. LeBlanc and Ducre and Patrick Dion, as well as
You could
um,
stick a pin in that just for those who will be listening to this, because you and I know who we're talking about, but the average person may not. So when you say E.C. LeBlanc, you're talking about Emmanuel Christopher LeBlanc, who was one of the co-founders of the Dominican Labour Party, the Mason and trade unionist.
absolutely correct. And in fact, my father was one of the, what I call it, the activists in his younger days with the Labour Party, one of the founders, so to speak. And in our house were a lot of meetings, communication between the leaders. He also had a very good friend called F.O.C. Harris, who was a judge in Trinidad for a period of time, but he was
Is that the
also
same Cozy Harris?
Cozy Harris. He was inclined. In fact, my father became godfather of one of his children, and in that regard too was what's his name, Ducre, N.A.N. Ducre, who was a minister of government. Um, my father couldn't make the visit to the church that day, and I became the godfather of one of N.A.N. Ducre's children, as I did also with E.C. Black. One of E.C. Black's children happened to have been someone that my father was supposed to represent at church as the godfather, and I did have to replace him because he was not available at that time. So there's a connection between my father and the Labour Party in a way that it caused me to have a desire to get involved in the politics, because when I was about 9, 10, 11, just like you, I guess, at your age, you were very much inclined. I would go to all the public meetings. And
Yes.
so I knew all of the ins and outs of the various communications that was taking place, the power speakers of the day, and I got
So did you
involved. I
hear
got
people? Did
motivated.
you hear people like Jacob Boyd?
Oh, yes, in white suits, splendidly
Tell
dressed
us,
in
tell
white
us about.
suits.
Most people may not know that Jacob Boyd was describe him for us, because you would know him better than I would.
Yeah, he was a mulatto looking, highly complexioned, excellent, ebullient person, quiet sometimes, but when he gets onto a platform, he was an orator of the highest order. And so, of course, was E.C. Black in his own style, completely different, not as academic. And I recall one time when E.C. Black, who, by the way, got a bridge named after him,
Yes.
and who, of course, is a founder member of the Labour Party with Phyllis and all three, which we can talk about later on. But Low Black happened to have been at a meeting one time, and he was expressing something that you, as a socialist, probably would recall as being important, because it was very simply said, but was well said. He said, "The day capitalists will take power in Dominica, angels shall wept." He may not be grammatically correct, but he made the
Yes,
point.
yes, yes, he
And
did.
of course,
Yes.
we could have done if we had continued allowing just those who have to control and dominate. And that's where I believe that my energy, my desire, my commitment, my enthusiasm to become a speaker of the level of someone like let's say Elkin Henry, who was there as well around that time, from the Maho area, who was
Yes.
who was excellent in terms of his deliveries. And I
Yes, he's a
recall at
brilliant
one
orator. He
meeting,
spoke with a degree of elegance.
if the elegance cannot be denied. In fact,
Let
his
me let me
elegance.
explain to you. Let me explain something to you. So when I was at sixth form, right around the time of the independence movement, I was at sixth form with his son. We call
Right,
him Wrong the Head, but his name was Edgar.
right.
And Mr. Henry's truck stall had a big truck that Edgar would take sometimes to school. And he gave me a ride. In fact, I lost my first watch on that truck. It just disappeared off my head. And up to this day, don't know where it went. But the truck stalled at the corner of Queen Mary Street and King George. And Mr. Henry is there, his son Edgar. And I was walking down from Astapan. And he says, "Hello, young fellow. You look pretty robust. Why don't you lend a hand so we can move this conveyance off into another direction?"
Well, I'll tell you what I remember of Elkidas at the point, because I went to all the public meetings from the time I was 9, 10, 11. My father brought me to the public meetings, wherever they may be, particularly the bottom of Federation Drive, and of course, the old Rosa Market and the Labour Party, the trade union, which was the focal point for the Labour Party and its movements. But there was a public meeting in Maho, and there was a fellow called Arsenal, who was, I believe, brother-in-law of Elkin Henry, who was disturbing the meeting constantly, and then coming back and forth and saying what you have to say and so on diatribes. Elkin turned around to him and said, "As for Arsenal, he's the biggest ass of them all." That flattened the crowd. So,
Yes,
it is that kind of connection that I had that caused me to, coming from grammar school, going to the same Shillingford Crescent, the self-help aided houses scheme, going to grammar school in the afternoons, or coming from school on my bicycle, I'd be the orator talking to that crowd. And in the bathroom, rather other people sang, but I spoke,
you
as
spoke.
if I'm
So you're
before that.
saying to me,
Yes,
you were in your quiet moments reliving your encounters with the famous orators of the day, like Elkin Henry and Jacob Boyd, and reciting from memory those things which later on helped you in your own career. Is that correct?
absolutely. That was my motivational force. In fact, my father, just to give you one example of why I really got extremely motivated, two situations. One was when he was finished doing he became a dry cleaner of suits, so that those who are more privileged could use his shop to get their coats and their whatever suits cleaned up in a very normal way. And so he was the city's dry cleaner. But then who was the one supposed to be carrying those suits back to the owner but me? And in many instances, I'll be coming to this house and I'll be told, when I knock the front door, they tell me go through the gate. There
Because
was
that was the
obviously,
social custom of the higher classes.
that's absolutely correct. And that
So you
hurt
had to
me.
go
But
through the servants. You had to go through the servants'
you
entrance.
have to go for the servants' quarters. You couldn't go for the front door, you know? And an interesting situation occurred one time when he had to pay some lady, whose name I wouldn't mention, a rate for a machine, a sewing machine. His sewing machine had gone bad and he had to rent one from somebody of the more privileged class. And that Christmas Eve, she came to him while she was in the middle of preparing some clothes for someone, and he hadn't yet got paid. And he's asking the lady for time out to give her the money later in the afternoon. And she was so harsh towards him and so disrespectful that I swore that when I get to be a man, that I'll deal with these people once and for all, to let them allow themselves to be respectful of those who are less fortunate. And so
Indeed.
the idea of the social revolution for me was important. It impacted
Yes.
with me, and I saw it happen. Gus, look at where you are.
Yes.
Look at
I'm a
who you
direct beneficiary of the social revolution of
and
the
so
Labour Party,
what
and
I'd
I'm
like you
very,
to
very
agree with
thankful
me,
for that.
what I'd like you to agree with me is that there was a social revolution.
Oh, there was.
Right.
I mean, there was, because I mean, OJ, remember, my parents were also from the country. My father, of course, was from Dailies, but my mother was in St. Joseph, and they told me about Jacob Boyd and E.C. LeBlanc, and when LeBlanc came back from his first trip overseas, what he said. Because in those days, people went to the Rosa Trade Union Hall in Lagos not to be entertained, They went to be educated. They went to be informed. I remember as a child, 4, 5, 6 years old, going with my parents and would stand there and listen. There was no jump up, there was no music, there was no rum. And so it troubles me when I see the debasement of public engagements in Dominica today, as if we cannot have a meeting anymore, that it has to be a carnival. I mean, there was absolutely, I want you to, am I making this up, or is that how it really was?
It's the absolute truth, to the extent that there was the bell ringer, a fellow called Santa P, who would be going around with the bell to announce the meetings. And so people would come to that with an expectation of being taught something.
Yeah.
And whilst the meeting is ongoing, you'd hear this very loud, boisterous voice in the somewhere behind the crowd saying, "Yo la, yo la, yo la, yo ko pan pukoyo."
Say that in
That's what
English. Say that in
they
English.
are here. They are here. They are hearing for themselves. That's when he
Yeah.
perceives someone of the opposite party
Yes,
standing
yes,
somewhere in the dark areas underneath a porch somewhere, hiding away from
yes,
the crowd, but
yes,
listening in to the meeting.
yes, yes.
And he would say that loud, boisterous voice saying, "Yola, yola, yola,"
That means
which
they're
means that
there,
they
they're
are
there.
here and they're
They're here.
listening for themselves. That
They
was it.
listen.
There was a lot of that kind of, how would I call it, theater. There was
Yes,
theater, live theater. And when you
yes.
heard the voice of Felician Allfrey, which is very aristocratic and come from a Caucasian woman who was a leader.
Explain to people who may not know who Felician Autry was.
Well, she was a lady from Dominica's linkages with the Nicholses. She was in England and she came
She
down
was she
in
was a white Dominican.
a white Dominican who came
Yes,
back after having gone through a period of apprenticeship, if there's such a word, in the labor movement in England. She
yeah.
came back down, and together with LeBlanc and Nichols and other such persons, created an energy for a demand for people responding to the opportunity given by the adult suffrage of 1951. So in
Yes,
55, the party was formed, and
yes.
the rest is
And
history.
basically, the Labour Party was formed as a socialist party modeled on the British Labour Party.
Absolutely, and that's where she contributed. And then you had E.C. LeBlanc, who came from the trade union. I originally believes he came from Grand Bay, and
Yeah.
he came on to Roseau and made a very strong presence representing the less fortunate. And so persons like Ducre and Stevens and Mabel Moore James and other such personalities, of course, including Yoli Blanc, they had joined in. And then you had the foot soldiers like my father, who dominated the Roseau North in so far as influence was concerned. And, if I were to just jump a little bit, when
Before you do that, Brother OJ, because you're moving quickly into the politics, but I want to get a little bit more about you and the society at your earlier stages. So your father was Perry Seraphine.
right,
He died at age 85 in what year? Do you remember?
he died about 10 years ago.
Okay, so that will be about 2014.
Yeah, thereabout, yes.
Okay. And then your mother, give me your first name again.
She was Theotil, Theotil.
Yeah, Theotil. And she died, how old was she when she passed?
She was about 88 years, you know.
What and when did she pass?
She passed about 14 years ago.
About
Yeah,
14 years ago. So about 2010.
thereabout, yes.
Okay. And siblings, any siblings?
My sister Josette, um,
Joseph.
yeah, she operates uh, at DBS Radio and had been there for a number of years prior to her departure into the mainland USA. And then she came back home and she's still with them, and she's a leader with the Girl Guides, and she's also a member of different organizations. She was in the Netball Players Association at one time, and she was also a dancer with the Lawrence group
Yes,
of dancers.
Waitekubuli, I believe.
White people, yeah. And so
So you
she,
only had
she
one, you only had one
one I had only one sister with my mom and my dad, but my dad had outside children. One is
okay,
in England, Helena, and the other one, James Grell,
okay.
who has since passed away.
I knew James. James Grell taught me at Standard 5 at the Goodwill Junior High School.
Okay.
And he also attended the SMA with my brother, deceased Dr. Wells Christian.
Right,
So
right, right.
I knew Grell. He was a very, handsome and dashing guy. And of course, later found out that he may have had some difficulty, but he was a decent teacher. And, was one of those persons that you remember. You just call him Grell. That's what we call him. So you had
Sir
Grell
Grell?
and you had,
Yeah.
yeah, Sir Grell, yeah.
Yeah,
So we had Grell, you had James, and you had Josette.
that's right.
So
And
one in the family and two on the
I had
outside.
a sister who is a sister to James Grell, who is Helena, who grew up in London from her very early youth. From the time she was early teens, she went to
Okay.
England and never came back to Dominica.
So you were born, your exact date of birth again, Brother OJ.
The 2nd of August of 1943.
So that's 8/2/43.
Right.
And you were born in Roseau.
I was born in Roseau, yes. And as
Yes.
I
What
said,
are
I lived in several households within the city, with Old Street and New Street and River Street and Virgin Lane and you name it, until we became more structured and started living in the area of Shillingford Crescent. Then my
Clinton
father ended
Crescent?
up with Foncolé, where he had a shop, and so we had a
Yeah.
home there as well. And then later on, we also had a home in 49 Greens Lane,
Yes.
Greens and Murphy's at the corner there.
Yes.
And to the
Yes.
extent that there is going to be some reunion of persons from that area, I understand that I've been placed as to one of those persons that they're going to give
Yes.
some
Yes.
credence to.
In fact, I remember the one at the corner of Greens and Murphy's Lane may have been close to the old library of the Movement for New Dominica.
That's right. Absolutely, sir. MND.
I used to visit that library quite often, sir.
Right,
So
right, right.
yeah. So let me ask you, what were your earliest memories of Roseau? What was Roseau like in the 1940s, 50s when you grew up?
It's a very interesting question you're posing because Roseau was particularly attractive from the perspective of those who wanted to just enjoy the fluidity of the movement of folks. That included going to the river bathing, because we had by the two bridges.
Big Stone.
That's right, the Big Stone, then Sikwi, they call it.
Stick a
On
pin
the
in that,
power.
Mr. Prime Minister. Can you tell the listening audience, most of whom would never imagine it, how deep it was around Big Stone at the bridges, where the Isilo Black Bridge is now, that it afforded swimmers the opportunity to actually dive into the water? Tell us about that.
Absolutely. You could dive into that water from the top of the stone and you dive in, and there was no fear of any consequence because it was that deep. And the same thing goes for on the power, which is higher up, and in Sikwi, which is also on that same. So as the river meanders, there were three big pools. In fact, there were four. There was one by the Roseau Market as well. There was a big pool. There's a stone that was almost a shape going up in a, what I'd say, in a way that it was a broken part of the bridge, of the river foundation there. And we'd stop up there and dive below. And so there were four areas in the Roseau River where you could dive and swim and drink the water, actually, because it was that clean.
Yes.
And
Yes.
one of the things that we did at
because our
summertime,
island at that time, the water catchments were much more plentiful because we did not have that level of deforestation. Is that right?
you're absolutely correct. And it led to all the way down to what we call Bushiwi, that is at the river estuary there. And what we found happening then was there are certain times of the year, particularly summertime, when the sea comes into the river, and we had these boards, and we actually did surfing with boards there,
Amazing.
And there was a time when the birds, we call them begas, if you want to call it that, would be around where you use catapult sticks and what have you to hunt them down,
Yes. Do they have catapults in Dominica anymore?
I don't see that again, and those were the days. And of course, around the area, going up to Goodwill and all the other areas at Stock Farm and such places, you'll be able to go and get your fruits, like all the different fruits that you could, mangoes or, you have nuts, that you could get
Cashew
in
nuts.
that area. Yes, cashew nuts.
Can you
And
tell
you
the
also
listening
have-
audience? Can you
Say
tell the
again?
listening audience of what it was like in the Roseau of your day when there was industry, like at Elrose, there was the stock farm, there was the cinema. Tell us about that.
Well, there was stock farm and there was Elrose and Company in that area where you had, like I would say, quite a lot of various fruits, which of course would be guavas and others like that. And there was freedom of movements of persons going into those areas. It was that which was there was belonging to the people. There wasn't any strong connection of ownership to the extent that would preclude you from taking that which is available. And so Rosa at that time was extremely interesting because at the early mornings, like around 5 o'clock in the morning, we'll be talking about Geneva Estate at some point, I imagine. But the people from Geneva Estate would come down with milk at 4 o'clock in the morning, 4:30, 5 o'clock. And so they'll be selling milk to the different places in Roseau, different houses in Roseau. And
Amazing.
one downside of it was that they didn't have toilets at most of the homes in the Roseau area. And so there was this gentleman who would come in and take care of that business. And
So you would have what you call chamber pots.
the chamber pots, yes. And
Or the
some guy would be
potty.
coming in there, yes, and take that pot and dispose of it and return the pot and that type of thing.
And
So
you
there
pay the
was,
person.
and I was
You pay
his
him.
his name was Ugly Willie. But
Okay, I remember him. I remember him.
yes,
Yes, he was by my time he
He
was
was
a
the
big,
janitor of the city, you
yes,
know.
indeed, indeed.
And then
There
we
was
had
also
personalities, the
yeah, there
personalities
was
around.
also a public inspector with a pith helmet and a khaki suit called Solomon.
Oh, yes. Very
Tell us
serious
about Solomon.
gentleman. Yes, yes, yes.
Tell
I
us about Solomon.
remember that there was a charge that he made which fell in the court, which was that somebody in a yard had some water, but it was running stagnant water. And so,
The English language is a hell of a thing, you know.
yeah, so
So
you,
it couldn't be both things at the same time.
it can't be both things. So, I mean, you had, that, of course, kite flying in the Roseau was very good tops, the use of tops and what have you.
Yes, yes. Tell us
And,
about the Windsor Park then.
oh, the Windsor Park was a place where you had the ability of persons who could play football and or cricket and or netball and rounders and so on. That was a place where the youth would gravitate and there would be a place of fun. But more importantly for me was the experiences at the Botanical Gardens next door.
Yes, talk about that. You read my mind. I was coming to the botanical gardens. Talk about
Yes.
that, sir.
Well, there we have on a Sunday there would be persons coming in to visit the park, the Botanical Gardens, and take a walk because at that time it was done in such a way that persons would enjoy the flora and fauna, of course, and the walks and whatnot, and of course the cricket game.
Stick a pin in that. People would actually dress up to
Oh
take a
yes,
stroll through the gardens.
that is very correct. And then, of course, at the back, for those who are in their teens, you'd have what your lovers lane, and you would take a walk there with your lady, a little girlfriend you saw at high school, and you all make a date to meet there and so on. And then the other persons would have their pram with their young children, their little babies walking.
And when you say pram, you're talking about a baby carriage.
That is absolutely so.
So people will be going through the gardens with their baby carriages, the prams.
Right, right, absolutely.
I remember doing that with our youngest sister.
Right, all right. But you're not admitting that you may have done that with the girlfriend at high school, though.
No, well, that's really off the topic.
The lovers did experience.
What I do know is at the back of the gardens, what you call the experimental station,
Right.
were a lot of, let's say, rare fruits like lychee and pomegranate and mangosteen, different things from the different parts of the British Empire that were being, let's say, experimented on. And young people go there to try to, what you call, partake of some samples at the dark of night.
That's true. But, there was another experience that I recall very well with some kids would be going and climbing the trees and to take some of the fruits from the trees. And then there would be the guards. And there was one, I remember his name was Horatio.
Horatio.
Well, there was this guy called Lazarus Cadet from the Roseau Mixed School who was up on the tree taking something, and Horatio came with the dogs and decided to wait until dark before this boy could come down. Because when you were caught, you were brought to the school or the school sent for your parent for
Mm.
having gone into this level of larceny.
Bring your
So
last name.
yeah, and so and kids would probably do their two-back, they call it, which is
Yes. Truancy.
truancy. And
Talking
so
about
that would be a
truancy,
popular
Prime
place to go.
Minister, talking about
Yes.
truancy, there was a truancy officer in Roseau by the name of Frank.
Right. And they were very serious about their job, eh?
Oh,
And they
very
did it in
serious.
such a disciplined way that they would make sure they take you to your family members or to the school teachers
Or to
and
the
ensure
police
that you're
station.
disciplined.
Or the
Yes.
police station.
Or the police station. Yeah.
Yes,
If you're
yes.
fortunate, if you're unfortunate to reach the police station, if you're fortunate, he may know your father or he
Yes.
may know your school teacher. And then
Yes.
he brings you to, there was, in fact, a discipline,
In the
and
society.
everybody was somebody's child. And so it was a situation of persons who were wanting to misbehave in a manner which is unacceptable to the neighbors. That neighbor would then bring you to your father, your mother,
Oh,
and
yes.
sometimes have the right to even scold you.
That's
And
right.
then if you complain, your father and your mother scold you as well. And so
Indeed.
there was discipline. And one last thing I can remember about Rosa is that struck me as very relevant was one where on a weekend, particularly on a Sunday as well, where the ministries is located now was the hospital.
Yes.
And there would be persons who would ensure that they go to the hospital religiously on a Sunday to visit the patients there. And so any
Right.
cousin, any relative, anybody that you knew of who was hospitalized, that is the afternoon where people come in and share some comfort to you. They'll bring you
I see.
something or share a good word. So there was
That's interesting.
camaraderie, in the city of Roseau, as I
Yes,
recall.
indeed. Let me ask you, tell us a bit about the stores in Roseau that you remember, the stores of note.
It is useful to mention that there was the incoming Syrians or Lebanese people like Ayub Dib, and of course, as the funds came in, and so did Nasif. And there were also Eunice, and one or two others, the Dib family. And it's interesting you mentioned that because
So Eunice, Dib, Nasif, Asafan were all Syrians or Lebanese.
that's correct. They all were. And they became involved with, first of all, going to the countryside with suitcases to sell their wares, and then they would come back. And as time went by, they grew into the store or the shop where persons would buy from them. I recall my mother, who was involved with this stall at the Roseau Old Market, the slaves market, and she had a stall right there. And she would get her items from Elias Nassif on a wholesale basis, and then she'd be selling retail in the shop. Together with George Gabriel also, who had
Yes.
a
Gabriel
business there
Cash and
too.
Carry, yes. Mhm.
That's very correct. So this was the early movement until eventually through the social transformation, you then end up with other people like Stop and Shop and Madge and Mary Austrian, other persons like that who grew out of this effort to become what's her name again? The lady Joseph, Flossie Joseph, and so on.
Dorsey
Now,
Joseph, Annette
then,
Saint-Hilaire.
yes, and so then they emerged out of that,
Yes.
and so that dominance of those persons were removed from them by the local entrepreneurs who emerged in the
In
60s.
your day, brother Prime Minister, were there many local, that is African descended or Carib descended shopkeepers in Roseau and the environs? And if so, who are they that you remember?
Well, like I just mentioned, Flossie Joseph is one of those.
Yeah,
Come
but
from
I'm
an
talking about in
already,
your childhood. I'm talking about in your
or in
teen
my
years.
childhood. Um, there was a gentleman called Shan who, in the corner, T.D. Shillingford, and in that area right in the corner there, the Phoenix area. Um, there were a number of others who were attempting to get involved with business. Um, but for whatever reason, I have found that the shops were what strategically located in
Yes.
various corners of the city, owned by local people. And there was one gentleman, Donald, who had a shop where the Barclays Bank is, and his forte was to do um, bread with potted meat and things of that sort. And then
I
there
see.
was Miss Eunice, who was uh, a lady who would do the bread and bunjao, they call it, and the
Yes,
ice
yes.
milk and what have you.
Was
And
there
there
a
was
lady called Puny? Was there some Miss Puny?
Miss Peony, yeah. And then you had Miss Olive, who was the person right opposite grammar school where it was located before, going to
So
the
you're saying that we didn't have restaurants in the way we have restaurants today, but you had people who made food.
That's very correct. And it was delicious. I remember, you go into those places where you would get, well, basically, it had to do with bread and something. And of course, what we call the squash, the lime lemonade, and that
Yes.
type of thing.
In those days, we had in Dominica something called lime juice cordial, which has disappeared.
So again, the what?
Lime,
Oh yes,
lime,
absolutely, absolutely. This is at one time, Dominica, as you know, if you do the history correctly, was one of the international producers, eminent producers of lime,
at one point in
and
time, the
lime
biggest
cordial.
producer,
Yeah,
the biggest
Elrose and
producer.
Company, Elrose
Yes,
Lime Cordial.
yes, indeed.
Yeah,
Let me ask you, where did you go to elementary school?
I went to the mixed school, which is close by the Acme Motors
So you're
garage.
another mixed school graduate like myself and Clayton Shillingford and all these luminaries.
That's right, right.
Luminaries.
So
You know,
that's
the
correct.
Rosa Mixed Infant School has graduated quite a astonishing amount of luminaries.
Yes, absolutely. In fact,
So,
in those days, we had even Anthony Joseph was one of my teachers at one time, and so was Mrs. Geoff Robinson,
mhm.
and persons like that. And it was a moment where you were disciplined, lots of discipline, and you were encouraged. In fact, it was control over the attitude of misbehavior, where anybody who's misbehaving would be given exact treatment that they deserve.
You're
And
talking about the
so
caning. You'll be caned.
that's right, absolutely that, yeah. And so Rosa Mixed School was, in fact, as you said, a breeding ground. I went from there to the what do you call the Chateau, which is
The
a
boys'
school
school.
close. Say again?
The Rosa Boys' School.
It's a Rosa Boys School. Well, it was a Rosa Mixed School too. The Chateau was another higher level of like uh, se- from second form, the second grade, going
Second
up to,
standard, yes.
yeah, you have people who were there, persons like Mr. Wills Javier, was there, Jerome Bazzi, that you might have heard about, was there as teachers and so on. And there are
Yes.
other teachers that were very strong in their principles, Mr. Fingal and others, and from there to grammar school.
Let me ask you this question. When you were at the Rosa Mixed Infant School, in those days, in the 50s, I take it, did you wear a uniform?
We wore uniforms, yes.
What were they made of and what were the colors?
Um, Khaki pants and white shirts.
I see, I see.
Yeah.
And how common was it for you all to have shoes? And if so, what kind of shoes?
Well, it was very common for us to have shoes. A lot of it was the plastic shoes was very common, at that time. And for those who could afford, you have some leather base shoe, but
Mhm.
mostly
You're
that. And
talking
some
about what they
tennis
call the
shoes. Tennis
toeless
shoes was very common.
tennis shoes, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And let me ask you this. In that period, did you all also go on parade, like Queen's Birthday Parade or Empire Day Parade or anything like that?
We absolutely did. We had to go to the parades, and it was also strong on athletics as well. We did a lot of athletic competitions. And so for those of us who were athletically inclined, there was somewhere that we could, and football and cricket.
Mhm.
So sports was very big, even at the elementary school. And
Yes,
I
yes.
remember people like a guy called Melton White, who became a professor somewhere in Canada, um, was my competitor with Lazarus Cadet, so I was one of the fastest runners of my class, and I went on to grammar school with that. But my training started there, as an athlete. And
So
so that was big in those days.
when did you take the common entrance exam to get into high
When I was
school?
11 years old.
Yes, yes. And you got into the grammar school in what year?
in 56.
56. And who was the principal then?
Archer.
And tell us about Archer.
Archer was the disciplinarian bar none. I believe everybody who went to school around that time will recall what he represented. And so here he was ensuring that
And
discipline was
Archer, Victor A.
Victor
Archer
A.
was
Archer.
a
Yeah,
McGill, Canada, that's McGill University in Canada, educated chemist and physicist. Is that right?
that's very correct. You have that correct. And but he had an impression. In fact, anybody who went to grammar school around that period of time have had that experience of the Archer experience.
Yes.
And
And
I recall
how would
one.
you qualify that experience? How would you, for persons who didn't know him, how do you describe him as a person and how would you describe that experience?
He was erudite, disciplined, firm, and someone that you would ensure that when he passes by, you get into rigid attention. He caught your attention for real. He was
Was
that
he
kind of person.
tall?
He was medium height. I would say somewhere around 5'10" or thereabout, from what I
Okay.
can recall. And then they were followed by a guy called Eugene Crick. Crick was a particularly strong person, huge guy. And I remember one day I happened to have been flaunting, escaping from a moment in the classroom because I hadn't done my homework and the master was expecting me to provide him with homework. And I went into the toilet area and was in the corner where the urine area is, the section where you urinate. And this huge person came through, and he was very much into a certain zone, and he removed whatever it was, and he displayed himself, only to see me in the corner. And
Oh
that
boy.
was the worst experience I've ever had in my life. When our eyes clashed, and then he said, "Go to my office," and that was
There's
just
what you
one of
call
those experiences.
mutual embarrassment.
Mutual embarrassment. And also, but in those days, you couldn't afford to be embarrassed that way too often, because
Yes.
expulsion was just around the corner and
Yes. Yes.
suspension was constant.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
we have had our humor. I remember one particular moment when there was this gentleman, well, I call him a gentleman, this boy who had his hair cut, but his mother decided that she would do it herself. And he had roads all over in his head. And he didn't look a very happy beaver then with that. But he misbehaved and somebody put him on the bench. And Charles Maynard, who was then one of those persons who was a teacher at the grammar school,
Yes.
came in and saw him on the bench, looked at him, and as he says to him, go to the headmaster, which was, I believe it was Archie at the time. And when he was going out, and when Maynard looked at his head, he said, "Come here, boy. Don't worry to go to the headmaster. Your head have saved you." So we had our fun.
Yes, yes, indeed. So you went to the grammar school from 56 to what year?
62.
So you went to the new school on Valley Road?
No, that was the Valley Road was just 63, I think it was.
Okay, I see. I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a breaking point.
Okay, outstanding. What were your favorite subjects?
I was literature, history, English, of course, um, um, geography. These were some of those that I preferred. The social studies. These are my favorite subjects.
And
And
who were some famous students of your
yeah,
day?
well, you had what's her name? Joan Sorrento was one of them, and the lady who got married
Well,
to
Joan
Harris.
Sorrento would have not been at grammar school. You had a co-ed school on only later. So you're not co-ed at the time.
No, no, she was at grammar school. Joan Sorrento, she was sister of the Sorrentos.
Was she teaching?
Yeah, she was teaching. Yes.
Okay, good. I was
Yeah,
talking
yeah.
about fellow
And then
students.
you also had Mrs. Harris.
Okay.
Um, her husband was in the Ministry of Agriculture.
Errol Harris, yes.
Errol Harris's wife,
He
you
used to
know.
be Brand before.
But she was yes, she was Miss Brand, yes.
Yes.
And she was also, both of them were actually, one was literature, one was English, and so on. And Alfred Levy, who died recently, was there
Yes.
as well. And then you had persons who were like Goodrich from
Yes.
Barbados, and
Yes. Yes.
one or two others of that ilk. But we also
Did
had some
Clayton
young
Shillingford,
masters who came. There's some
did
young
Clayton
masters who
Shillingford,
came.
did
Clayton
Clayton
Shillingford
Shillingford,
was one of the. I was just going to say that some young masters who came in, just Clayton Shillingford and Herbert Charles and persons like that. So
yeah.
they moved from grammar school, sixth form, to become teachers.
But
And
when you
one of
talk about
the
Herbert Charles, you're not talking about the same Hubert Charles who's now ambassador out in
no, no, no,
Dubai.
no, no. This Charles is he migrated very early. Herbert was his name, Herbert
I see.
Charles, and he migrated very early to Canada, and
I see.
he was a pretty well groomed guy. And then you had, of course, Wills Javier was there, and grammar school was interesting.
Did you go to school with Rosie Douglas at all?
No, he was ahead of me.
Okay, okay.
Yeah,
He's ahead of you. Okay. And so were you in the cadet corps while you're at the grammar
I
school?
was in the cadet corps. Yes,
Tell us
very
about that.
interesting time. We had persons like uh, what's his name? Goodrich was around. There was Richards, who became an ambassador
Yeah.
on the United Workers' Party. Um, there were two of those that stuck out with me. There was somebody called or Mr. Ward, a Bajan, who was a Sea Scout person,
Mhm.
and he was really
So
pushing
you
Sea
also
Scout.
had a Sea Scout troop at the grammar school?
That's right, yeah. A
Okay.
gentleman called Mr. Ward from Barbados.
And what about Earl Johnson, Major Earl Johnson?
Oh yes, and Earl, of course, Earl Johnson, Major
Yes.
Johnson,
Yes,
and
indeed.
you know, yeah, these were they who were in the cadet
So,
corps.
so why did you become a lance corporal, corporal sergeant?
I didn't get so far up. I was just an ordinary, well, a lance corporal. I was the furthest I could reach. But prior to
Yes.
that, I was already a scout in the scout um, experience. First of all, as a cub, and then a scout,
How
member
did
of.
the cadet corps and the scout movement before that and the cub movement before that shape your life?
Totally. In fact, there was a lot of discipline. I mean, persons like in the club movement, there was Mr. Bertrand, I think was his name, and Sylvester Joseph and people like that who were very much into the club movement there at that time. And then the cadet corps was also one of discipline. You had to behave in a certain way. Your character was blended in a way that made it imperative that you understand the whole ambit of dressing properly and respecting your elders, and you then had acceptance of leadership. The others above you that told you what to do and you had to follow suit, and it was a very good experience actually.
Indeed, indeed. How important do you think the cadet corps, Boy Scout, Cub Scout to be for developing nations to have more thorough immersion of our youth in
I
those
think it's
programs?
I think that together with the 4-H club, I mean, when you have to add all of these together, this was the formative years of the young men and women. The, the, the society itself grew out of that, from the club movement to the scout movement to the cadet movement to 4-H and all of that. That grooming established the character that you could become. And I believe persons of the older generation, to the large extent, those who were persuaded to remain on course and to accept their realities, that they have to man up to expectations from the society, had to develop that strength to accept the leadership, to accept responsibility, and so on. And I think without that, I'm not hearing much about 4-H Club anymore, nor am I hearing the Boy Scout and the Cub movement, and even the Cadet Corps being very active these days. And I think that is what's lacking right now. It's a
Thank you.
medium portion of education from childhood to manhood. I think that's the missing gap.
So you're saying that as a region, a Caribbean region where there's issues of crime, and Dominica in particular, where we're from, that there needs to be much more of a focused public policy effort to ensure that these organizations, Cub Scouts, Boy Scouts, Girl Guides, Brownies, 4-H Club, Cadet Corps, that those organizations are strengthened to guide our young people. That's your prescription.
Well, strengthened and probably reintroduced, because strengthening is on what's existing, and
That's
what
right.
about what's not existing. And one is not getting the impression that there's much being said about it. Even if it exists, there isn't a lot of energy and spirit and activity that gives you a feeling that persons are motivated to become part of that process. And I think that's what's lacking to a large extent in character building.
Outstanding. So you leave the grammar school in 62. You're now about what, 16, 17 years old?
About 18
Yes.
thereabout. Yeah.
What do you
I was
do?
supposed to, well, I was supposed to have gone to a scholarship program in Canada, and that was around the time of Rosie Douglas's situation.
Yeah.
And that particular opportunity for that scholarship was put on hold by the Canadians. And then I went into the business of the insurance brokerage, and I got trained in that. I went to the islands together persons like Curtis Tong and others like that. And we were trained under the Dale Carnegie Institute. And so that was about mind dynamics, through people like Napoleon Hill, Think and Grow Rich, and that type of thing. The whole ambit of how to be
So you're
self-motivated.
familiar with Dale Carnegie and Napoleon Hill for a long time.
Oh, yes, that's my forte. That's my education. And we did courses. The combined insurance company that I attended ensured that we did courses with those organizations. And it is as a consequence of that we evolved into becoming the men that we were, that we arrived at. I mean, later on, we had persons like Eustace Francis, a guy from Antigua who became the acting Governor General, of Antigua. Curtis Tong emerged into a very professional life of the insurance brokerage business, and many others in various parts. In fact, what transpired was I did get a job for a brief moment with the audit department and the post office in Dominica. And what transpired for me was to understand that to emerge into anyone of any consequence as far as pay is concerned, or as far as leadership is concerned, is that you may have to wait a number of years before you become a permanent secretary. I wasn't impressed with that. And then shortly after that, I saw these young men with tie and coat and all of that looking really involved with a certain lifestyle that I thought I could enjoy. And I went to where they were being held at some hotel, and I asked for an interview, and I passed the interview. And I was told that what they were doing was to select the best young men that they could find, the charisma that they wanted, to become part of that company.
Because Brother OJ, you're selling an insurance policy, and as I tell people many times, if you're buying life insurance, you most likely, if it's not universal life or whole life, you will never enjoy that policy. It will be enjoyed by your descendants,
Right.
those who will inherit your estate. So
Right.
to make that sale, you have to be persuasive. Am I right?
You absolutely have to be persuasive, and you must be in a position to anticipate any conceivable rebuttal that is coming at you, so that
So someone says, well, OJ, you want me to pay $50 a month, just use that as an example, for a policy that I will never enjoy. Why should I buy it at all? Let my children make their own way.
Not really. I mean, at that point, you have to demonstrate the necessity for taking care of your responsibility. These are the bills that you have before you. That's what's going to happen. Should you just close your eye tomorrow morning or tonight, what are you leaving behind as bills to your children and your wife? And then you're able now to convince them on that basis, and that in 20 years' time, you'd be so and so an age, and therefore you benefit from the resources of your having contributed to a savings plan, which at the same time gives you a maximum return. If you were to, I dare say, pass away, then somebody's going to take that.
A guy who came to my office along my law firm had me buy a term policy. We bought term when the kids were younger, and he says, "Well, Gabe, you got to put that money aside in case, you got to put on your wooden pajamas. He called it my wooden pajamas,
Oh, sir,
because
interesting.
he wanted to make it a little funny, but what he meant was a coffin. That's what he was talking
That's
about.
correct. I get you. But then, at the end of the day, I mean, the reality for those persons who received the insurance benefits was that you anticipate that you would have a potential bill being left behind if somebody comes and just knocks you out down the road. You live in a family in a position where they can honorably live,
Precarious,
and
very
they can
precarious position.
you live them precarious, but if the insurance, they're in a better position,
Better
and so do
position.
you. At the same time, a large percentage, in fact, there was this mutual insurance type which is investment driven. There was a problem in Trinidad and so on recently, where I think there was American Life or British American or something. But normally speaking, is that your money is reinvested for you, and then you get returns on your investment. So, these are things that I used in those days. But then, to be honest with you, my energy and my zeal went into other directions. I mean, when I came back from the Virgin Islands, I've been to all the islands in the Caribbean. And for a young person of 19, 20, that's a huge experience, a life experience that was very good for me because it created confidence. And I returned to Dominica. I went back into the insurance field. And shortly after that, went into investments and so on, like Dominica Airways and things of that sort.
Yeah. Brother OJ, you were one of the early persons involved in the aviation industry. Did you also take your pilot's license?
This is the biggest regret that I've ever had. Um, I can fly. I was in the cockpit with my captain, which is a chap called Fonso Laville, and my co-pilot was C.K. Shillingford, who eventually had his own airline here in St. Thomas. And I was there, and they showed me the ropes. And after a period of time, you get able to adapt to the environment that you're in. But I was a manager of the company and a salesperson in and out of the islands, focusing on business. And so I never took time out to do the 6 to 9 month period to go and get an official license. But I knew how to handle the various aspects of flying, but
So
never
you
got the
could you
license.
could land and take off.
That's correct. But
And
and
you have
before
done that. And you have done that.
I have done takeoff, not landed, because the pilots didn't want me to do that in the event of any mishap. Taking off is a little bit easier, so you steep and you go. But then landing, it's precarious, because you have to be very clear as to what happens in the event of any situation, insurance or whatever, people's lives on board or whatever. So I was not able to do that. And
What is the
that's
name
one of
of
my
your
regrets.
airline, OJ? What is the name of your airline, your air
Dominica
company?
Airways. It's called
Dominican
Dominica
Airways.
Airways. And we
And you
carried
did you did both passenger and cargo?
We did passenger and cargo. We carried the Swing Stars group and Exile One, not Exile One, Gramax to several situations within the Caribbean. We did carry a number of other groups, the Sufra group, to some exercise out there. We carried a number of persons who had to do sporting events and so forth. So we were pretty much active, and we did a lot of transportation of agricultural produce to various parts of the Caribbean. In fact, one of the reasons why we went into the business was we were given assurances by the marketing board, then led by Michael White. And you must have heard of Michael White. He's a very popular
Yes,
Dominican in Canada.
I
And
know.
he was the manager then with a chap called Keith Shillingford, who were working there. And Ukraine was the trade minister. We got a contract to carry agricultural produce for the marketing board into respective destinations, particularly in the United States, Virgin Islands. Unfortunately, it turns out that somebody convinced them that they should use a boat instead. And I got the news whilst I was having lunch at my mother's house that they have now taken a contract with a Johnny Walker boat. And we were left stranded, although that was a contract by which we purchased the plane from a chap called Lil Drew from Miami. So it turns out that
Was it
we had
the twin engine plane?
a twin engine, 30-seater, carrying 8,000 pounds. It's a DC-3, they called it.
Okay.
And, I recall one time we were traveling to Guadeloupe. And when we got to Guadeloupe, there was an issue there of an engine leak. I just purchased fuel from Guadeloupe because that's where the price was right, as opposed to the Virgin Islands. And we used all the money that we had. And when we saw the leak, then they had to go to Puerto Rico in order to get some part to put on it. And I was here at the airport for about 3 or 4 days awaiting them. And there was food on board ship, on board the aircraft, which could not be allowed in because it was not consigned to Guadeloupe as per their rules. And here we are, a plane full of food, and I couldn't eat it because the bananas were not ripe enough, the plantains were not ripe enough, and I was hungry. And I remember sitting into the departure lunch and Dominica was passing, guy who worked at Cable Wireless, and say, "Oh, Jay, come along." Perry, they used to call me in those days. Would you mind having a lunch with me? Not realizing how hungry I was. That was the best meal I ever had. So those are experiences.
So you're rough and tumble businessman flying the skies of the Caribbean with cargo, with passengers. Amazing.
Yes, absolutely. And then, of course, there was a Green Lantern Club. You might have heard of it, which is
Of
really
course.
deep.
I mean, I was too young to go, but it was right there by where the Deepwater Harbor is.
That's correct. And
Did you own that? Did you own that?
That was the owner of it, yeah. With
Didn't know that.
Yep.
Yes, yes.
And then there was one of those experiences where we started on the Friday nights in Dominica. Before that, there was you go to a dance on a Saturday, but Friday was out of it. But Swinging Star had some problems practicing by Norman Layton up there, close to the bishop and the priest and all of that. And the noise was becoming a little bit of a nuisance. So they agreed to come down to Green Lantern to practice on a Friday. And then the crowd started coming in to get free dancing and so on. And so we decided to put a fee. And that's how Friday night dancing started.
Amazing.
So it was a good
So you're a
thing.
pioneer in dancing, sir.
Precisely so. Pioneer
So
the
what
Friday night
was
party.
the cover charge? Oh, Green Lantern.
Well, just $3 in those days, enough to buy
Yes,
a drink,
Yes.
Well, I'll share that one last one with you before I leave you on this particular topic, because it's one that's dear to my heart. I happen to have been blessed and fortunate that as an insurance man at the same time, the money was not exactly a problem living at my parents' house. So I just purchased a brand new Hillman Minx car, and then CK Shillingford, who was my partner there at that club, came and tell me that there's something called a Viva SL90 that just arrived by Shillingford and stuff like that, by the customs. So we went there and we looked at it. It looked like a Mustang. And he influenced me to buy it. Of course, I didn't have too much to influence because I really wanted it. But we had dances from a Wednesday night leading to, which is Christmas Eve, leading to Christmas Day, to Boxing Day, to Friday night, to Saturday, and then the Sunday punch party. And then the same thing for New Year. So we had 12 dances in a row, and money was good. And so when we decided to buy those vehicles, we went to Mr. Shillingford, Mr. Bully at Shillingford, and we had a suitcase with money. Fortunately,
Amazing.
it wasn't the drug days,
No. This is all for 12 days of dances.
Of dances, yes. And the money was good. And so we went in there, we opened up the briefcase, and we counted the money for the guy. And he's there totally and completely astounded. Because normally, if you go to buy a new car, you go to the bank, and the bank needs a check and so on. But here's these two guys coming and checking money to buy two vehicles. That was an experience I'll never
Amazing.
forget.
How much did you have in that suitcase there?
Well, it could have been anywhere between 12,000 or so dollars thereabout.
Amazing.
In those days, the $6 to $8,000 will get you a vehicle.
Yes, that is a lot of money.
Yeah, it was a lot of money.
Because I think
about 60,000 now. 60,000.
I went through my father's. My father fire brigade trunk, and I got his diary. He was a diarist. He kept the diary from after the war through 1972, and he was saying he was keeping his accounts. Sometimes you'd get $100 a month, $70 a month.
Yeah. Those were the days. In fact, the average civil servant in those days was about $400 or $500 a month. And
no. That was in the 70s. I'm talking about in the 60s.
Okay, all right. Okay,
much less.
All right.
But let me ask you this: so, how long did you have Dominica Airways?
We had Dominica Airways from 1969, 70 to about 73. No, till 75. About 75. Because I became Minister of Communications and Works responsible for aviation. And for whatever reason, I allow myself to be convinced that aviation being what it is and being a minister is a conflict of interest. And I had to dispose of my shares to Air Martinique, who purchased my shares. And
I
then
see.
I continued, yeah, unfortunately.
Yes. So let's talk about the political life. What caused you to get into electoral politics, to be part of the 1975 election under then Patrick John, what was called the electrifying team? And I believe you're one of the last members of cabinet from that time alive. You made me to understand that Ferdinand Parelon is also still alive. God bless him. But tell us what caused you to get into electoral politics in 75.
Well, first of all, there was a situation of location. My mother had a shop next to the Commerce Sports Club, which is close to Eric's Bakery in that area on the roadside. And I would go there to play table tennis because I was an avid table tennis player. I played at island competitions and all that as well. And that was at the Commonwealth Club of Patrick John. And so I'd go in there and get involved with this.
So
But
hold on, for those who would not know, Patrick John is referring to was the premier from 1974 when Edward Oliver LeBlanc resigned and went back to the cars. He later became premier. And so he was a sportsman at the Commonwealth Club, and that's where you met him.
that's correct. And having met him there, and my father and he, had very good relations. And at that time, there was the movement of change of leadership. E.O. LeBlanc had decided that he was no longer ready to accept what was ongoing in the dynamics of the politics of Dominica at that time. Very aggressive, very ferocious. You had in 1971, 16th of December, revolution
Take a
was
pin in
taking
that. Can
place.
you tell the citizens of Dominica and other persons who listen to this, what was the 1971 riot at the House of Assembly by the Freedom Party partisans?
Yeah, well, there was E.O. LeBlanc having just won an election in 70 for an overwhelming majority. And you as the historian will probably be aware of that. But in 71, it turns out that LeBlanc had the idea of having a market in the Roseau area close to the riverbank, which had been housed in some building called the Coronation Hall. And that land was belonging to the Roseau Town Council. And LeBlanc felt it was absolutely necessary to improve the conditions of the people from the countryside, from the rural areas, who would be coming down with their goods and have a comfortable place in order to sell their goods, their provisions, and so on. And it happened that the land, as it were, belonged to the council. And Eugenia Charles and the Freedom Party had just won a city council election and felt that that authority of ownership of that land belongs to the council. Incidentally, I had competed. That was my first salvo at political activity when I was a candidate for the Roseau Town Council elections in 1970. And it was persons like Flossie Joseph, and I remember Hugh, Hugh White, Bernard Coulslatig, and others, and myself, who were the candidates for that election. In those days, the city council election was similar to a national election, very aggressive, very same activity. It was similar to national elections. And we lost, and they won. Having won, LeBlanc
When
still
you say
decided
they won, you mean the Freedom Party
the Freedom
partisans?
Party won that election. And as a consequence of that, it was their determination that it was their authority to dispose of the land whichever way they wanted to. And LeBlanc contested that, and he went into some desire to, in fact, take control over the rights of an authority to determine what would happen for that particular um, um, ownership of that land. So a bill was about to be established to create the rights to do so. And the persons like the Waterfront Advocates Union, Louis Binois, and others, and a large number of persons who represented the civil service hierarchy and other persons of influence converged at the parliament, took the mace and had a struggle with someone called Eustace Francis, who was at
Eustace
that time,
Francis, so the grammar school boy, he
yeah,
gone to school in England and become an attorney. Was a former cadet actually, and
that's
had
right,
been in the Royal, like Mike Douglas and others, had been in the Royal Air Force, like Vic
right.
Revere.
He was in the Royal Air Force, yes. And so he had a struggle with them, and the police were very hesitant in taking control. And it was a preliminary test run, as happened on the 29th of May, 79.
Yeah, yes.
Very, very
So
serious matter. In fact, your uncle, H.L. Christian, wrote extensively about this in his book. And
yes,
that's something for reference by those who are interested. But it's a
yes.
moment in time when it demonstrated that the opposition forces were becoming aggressive and hostile to
Yes,
what
because
the
by that time, let the record reflect, Brother OJ, that the Freedom Party in Roseau was quite strong in Roseau and Goodwill and so on. And the Labour Party's grip or influence in the trade unions like the Dominica Amalgamated Workers Union, DAWU, the Waterfront and Allied Workers Union, WAU, led by Louis Benoit, DAWU, led by Anthony Joseph, and the Civil Service Association, led then by Charles Severin, they were all anti-labor. Am I not correct?
You're very correct. And that was the contradiction because the Labour Party came out of the labor movement. It came out of the Dominica Trade Union. And it
Yes.
was for the people's rights that and the right to vote, as opposed to the landed gentry of period before 1951, before adult suffrage, that they in fact uh, got the influence from the trade union movement. Persons like Anthony Joseph, who was in fact a teacher of mine, as I mentioned, at the Rosamond School, and the trade union movement was very aggressive in those days, and you had the Employers Federation, you had the Dominica Association of Industry and Commerce, and all of those organizations were well structured. And so the leadership of that having swung towards the Freedom Party,
So
their membership.
let us let future generations understand what we're facing in 1970 going forward. The Labour Party won office in 61. It led to a social transformation, led to an explosion in the amount of Dominicans entering high school from the countryside. You had land reform, you had increased benefits, you had better health care, you had more scholarships for higher education, you had finished that all free while Minister of Social Welfare in the Federation opening the technical wing, which is where a lot of welders and others got trained in vocational skills. You had the opening of the original youth camp at Londonderry under the auspices of H.L. Christian and directed by it was the same Earl Johnson who was at school with you. But at the same time that social transformation is coming up with a growing middle class from the civil servants that have been educated by the Labour Party, you have the civil society organizations, the trade unions, WAU, Waterfront and Allied Workers Union, DAWU, Dominica Amalgamated Workers Union, the CSA, the Civil Service Association, the Dominica Employers Federation, the Dominica Association of Industry and Commerce. All of these civil society organizations, OJ, by 1971, 72, 73, are increasingly antagonistic to the Labour Party. How do you explain these? I understand the Employers Federation because that's the employers. But
Or
how do you
DAIC.
find DAIC? I understand that because Association of Industry and Commerce, those are the shop owners and hoteliers and these big businesses. But how do we get to a place where the children of the Labour Party in the trade unions turn against the Labour Party? How do you explain that?
This has been in my view, one of the areas of my rebuke, because you were at that time called either privileged because you came from the city of Roseau, or you became a terminology used contribuki, lesser endowed financially or otherwise by surname value from the countryside. And then you have been empowered by the movements of the labor, the trade union movement, and the Labour Party by its example through Lee Bland and others, having ensured that persons have the right to opportunities equal to whether they are from the country area urban area, rural or urban. And there were situations that are so obvious to us where to get a job really in the bank, you have to have certain qualifications, namely color skin and or name value. And so it was of great consequence to the.
OJ, I think you've been very diplomatic. Let's be very blunt. The Dominica of your childhood, you didn't say it then when I asked you about Roseau, but it was a society that was one of class and color prejudice. Am I not correct?
You're very, very correct. It was class prejudice, it was color prejudice, and it was geographically prejudicial if you come from one part of Dominica or the other. If you're from Roseau, you're privileged to a large extent compared to those who have come out of the countryside, like your father, people in the east, and my father's people, either in Roseau,
What would they
south of
call them?
Roseau.
Tell the listeners what they would call people from the countryside.
I just mentioned the country bookies, they call them, and it is an unfortunate occurrence that once they were being freed, that suddenly the children started to dispose of those names by joining the forces with the persons who were privileged. And so that was the fight that persons like myself were involved in. And as a very young person, because I became a member of the Labour Party's executive at 25 years old, as treasurer of the party and vice president and then president of the party during my early 20s. And my struggle was to borrow from Eric Williams' Massa Day Dead. And I had a strong issue.
He said Massa Day Done.
Massa Day Done, yes. And consequent upon that was my affirmation that we all have a right to survive equally once we have the right desire to develop that which God granted us the power to be. And so there were laws that were being passed by the Labour Party, which included the Aliens Landholding License to protect our lands, the Beach Ordnance Act to protect our beaches, also the protection by way of the Rent Restriction Commission to ensure that rents were not going up as the owners, the landlords wished it to be, but that has to be based upon certain economic considerations and so on. And the extension of education to more and more persons from various parts of the countryside. So when this thing occurred in 71, where the mace was tampered with and the revolution had taken place, so to speak, and in 73 you had the Papa D situation with this person who was
that was a strike. That is Papa D was Daniel Corderon
at the DBS radio. Yeah,
he was a newscaster or
right.
disc jockey at the state radio station. Daniel Corderon, whose mother was C.C. Corderon, and the CSA went on strike, and the government had to declare a state of emergency.
Yeah, and persons who were arrested, persons like Maxime and Sims, Ozzy Sims, and so on.
And Severin as well.
And Severin were arrested. When that came down, the Freedom Party then, having been able to convince the leadership, the Anthony Josephs, the Louis Binois and others, to become subject to the influence of the political dynamic of the Freedom Party, it turns out that Leblanc started getting increasingly frustrated because his dream, his ambition, his expectation was that which he had done was the doorway for the man from the various parts of Dominica. And also, even within the Roseau environment, you had the founder members of the Waterfront Workers Union, which was Patrick John and the same Louis Binois and others. The expectation was that now that they have moved forward to an extent where they can make certain demands for increased wages, the quality of life went up in a vertical direction. It was an extremely positive period when people who were usually treated as bod lame, that is to say, the niggers by the sea.
That's right, neg bod lame, niggers by the sea. That's right.
That's right, and they were able now to turn their economic life around And
Stick a
it's
pin
not
in
being
that so
done
people
anyway.
understand. Stick a pin in that. So for those who will listen to this when we're long gone, Dominica did not have a deep water port until the Labour Party put it in under your administration, essentially Patrick John's time, at
Right.
Foncolay there, Woodbridge Bay. In those days, the boats would come and anchor offshore, and lighters, these are big rowboats, would be rowed to the ships, and the stevedores had to take the 100-pound bag of flour, 100-pound bag of rice, 100-pound bag of sugar, what have you, and other boxes, put that in the lighter and row it back. And it was very hard work, but it was very poorly paid. So it was not until the Labour Party came into power that there was this rise in income of the stevedores. So stevedores now became middle-class people. Am I correct?
You are absolutely correct. And just to add to that were the banana couriers. Now, and that's where my family got into it, because my mother ended up with a shop in Foncolay next to the banana shed. And so there'll be truckloads of banana carriers, of trucks carrying bananas to the plant for distribution to the lighters. And you had the ladies that would be doing the movement of carrying heads on their heads, and then having to be given a token for every banana that they carried. And they would be hustling like bees, running to the port to dump the banana onto the lighters. And these lighter men would then have to go to the sea area where the geese boats were anchored, and have to lift them up and put them into the various holes of the ship. And so there was hard work then. And my parents would be up till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, almost twice or 3 times a week, whilst they're doing this movement. And they made a lot of money that way by selling the various requirements for food and drinks and whatnot. And I believe that's where our family benefited. But on the other side, the people who were doing that kind of work suffered the consequence of very minimum wages until the Waterfront Allied Workers Union was formed. And then the benefits grew. And unfortunately, the leadership of Patrick John, when he got into politics, national politics, was left to Louis Benoit and others who, for reasons that I have not been able to understand, were able to move their loyalty to the employer class of the Freedom Party. And so losing the control of their own interests and pass it on to those who are more privileged than them, even just a generation ago. And
I
so,
want to say something that may not have been said. When I was a child in Roseau, around the time you'd come to our house in your Volkswagen to sell insurance, we lived in Boards Avenue, down from the grammar school, the new grammar school, and there was a hostel there. Most Dominicans do not know that. It was a small hotel or dormitory for children from the countryside. And when they'd be passing to go around town after school, they'd be talking a lot of foreign language. What was that foreign language? Well, a lot of them were from Margaret Wesley, so they had a different accent. So the perception in Roseau for people who were in Roseau was that the Labour Party was the party of country bouquets. So even children in town who were educated wanted to go to the St. Mary's Academy, because the St. Mary's Academy was considered at that time the school for the Roseau people, and the grammar school was considered the school for the country people, because there's a hostel there. No other school in Dominica had a hostel on its compound. W.S. Stevens was the Minister of Education. Where was he from? Can you tell the listening audience where he was from?
from Marigot. He was from
That's from,
Marigot.
that's
Yeah.
from. So
And
you see what's happening? You see what's happening?
yeah, a
You see
former
what's
teacher.
happening? So people in Roseau, therefore, began to associate the Labour Party with the country. And so people like Zabuka, that's Louis Benoit, Anthony Joseph, who were from the Roseau area, they began to gravitate towards the Freedom Party. So you had almost a geographic bias and prejudice. So they were not looking at class, politics, or philosophy or ideology. They were looking at it from the perspective of geographic prejudice. These are country people trying to come to Roseau, like Libla, who's from Viecaz, which is a country area, trying to come to town and tell us what to do. That was the sentiment that was, because I had family members who were involved in the 1971 thing, where my uncle was in the Labour Party, but because they were from Roseau, I will tell you, as a cousin of mine, Kay Peters, I remember Kay Peters at my Auntie Flossie's home taking a Freedom Party position. And she's telling me, this is Kay, that she gave them what was coming to them. But she's at the home of the sister of H.L. Christian. Are you listening, brother? You see what's
Very
happening?
clearly, very clearly. What you're
Did
saying
you know
is,
Kay Christian?
of course. So you're saying exactly what transpired in those days. And then you asked me a question. You did say to me, what motivated me in 1975? And I'll say this, that uh, recently I had a birthday situation of celebration and so on. And young Lou Black up from Toronto uh, reminded me that I was a visitor to his father's house, and he remembered me sitting in with his father and talking at length and what have you, and getting the persuasions of old man Lou Black, which was the truth. And I also had this close relationship, having been the godfather of one of his children. The same with Ducre, I had a godfather relationship with him. And a lot of people don't know it, but Libla and myself were also very close because my father would bring me up to Montbruce to see Libla and to have meetings with Libla. And Libla, rather interestingly enough, even when he resigned from the politics of the Labour Party and national politics and went into a happy retirement where he was no longer involved with the give and take of national politics. When the Democratic Labour Party was launching the candidacies and the candidates in the Roseau North at the Pottersville Savannah, he elected to come and be present at that particular juncture. That's the first time he ever went back into the political presence as a politician
But I don't think he
after
spoke.
having resigned.
But I don't think he spoke.
He did not speak, but you
Because
know
I
he
was
was
there.
there.
Because
Right.
I was one of the organizers of that
Okay.
event. And
Happy
I'll
for
tell you
you.
what you said. I'll tell you what you said.
Right.
You said you working class people have forgotten your roots. You've gotten married to the, you know, highly colored, blue-eyed lady. You take her up the aisle, and you forgot Nick Bodlame or something like that. And then Eustace Francis said, yeah, some of you like Babs Dyer, you want to go and you're pressing your little people in favor of the other people, and you go into the woman, meaning Miss Charles, and you're saying, yes, ma'am, we're doing good in goodwill. So there was this,
You have a photographic recollection there and a good memory. But let me just say this. As a consequence of all of those relationships that had grown for me in a personal way, where I knew Lou Black and Ducre and LeBlanc and so forth, and Ronald Amo and Etienne and those other guys, when LeBlanc decided to resign and retire, there was that call for a new leader. There were some people who had the view that LeBlanc might have had a special affinity towards Ronald Amo, but the reason being that Ronald Amo was someone who, as someone who had been living close to the Viejas constituent, who had an estate there in Eden or what it was called. And he was being groomed at one time, but then he fell on his own sword because what transpired with Ronald was that he felt that LeBlanc should have left earlier by some prearrangement that he anticipated would have been accepted by LeBlanc. LeBlanc did not go in any particular relationship with him on that regard. But more importantly was that Amo felt the pressure from his class because he was bourgeois, he was mulatto, and he was privileged as a landed gentry. In fact, I had a coinage myself of the word called lad, Leblanc, Amo, and Douglas, meaning the owners of the large estates. And at this juncture, maybe I'd even divert a little bit and say to you, I had a problem in understanding why your uncle at one point thought that I had had an arrangement to replace Patrick with Michael Douglas, when in fact that's totally impossible. Because at that point, I wanted to have had that conversation if I had had that opportunity before he passed, to say there was no able way in which I could believe that someone of the landed gentry who enjoyed the privilege of family and social abilities and so forth to dominate in a way that persons with this large land estates were dominating, that I would replace or seek to replace with someone that came from the grassroots. That wasn't
And when you
possible.
say land, you mean Laville, or Douglas.
That's correct.
Yes.
And so
Because you
when
said
it came
LeBlanc,
to,
so that's
that's right. So what transpired then was when the election for a new leader came up, I took upon myself as the treasurer of the party then to have gone to the assistant secretary treasurer, which is Acme Trocad, and asked for the names of the persons who were registered to vote. And there was a long list of persons who hadn't yet paid up their dues. I then went to persons like George Karam, and who's a member of the party, and Bernard Koolslatig, who members, and they contributed, and we paid off the dues. And my father and a chap called um, Hugh KB, then went and picked up those persons who had been paid up as financial members and brought them to the convention. And that's how Patrick won his seat.
and
As a
that's a
result,
convention. That's a convention at the parish hall.
that's very correct. And so he was able to outmaneuver through my effort and my father's effort to become that. And Patrick became loyal then to me in the sense
Yes.
that I helped him to become the leader. And although the new constituency that was formed, which was the Canefield Valley constituency, was then formed, and he had Arnold Active, who was his brother of the struggle of the Waterfront Workers Union, who wanted to have been in that seat. He chose me instead. And so then that's how I became the person to represent that constituency. And I had fought fight with Rupert Sorrento, I won. So that answers how I emerged.
Yeah.
Having been, first of all, in the 70 situation, contesting the Rosatom Council election, maybe around 25, 26, or whatever I was like.
So in 1971, there's the attack on the assembly. The bill is squashed. It's not passed. The Freedom Party grows stronger. There's a 73 strike. 74 Libya resigns. Patrick John is prime minister.
It's
There's the
premier.
dread.
It's premier.
I'm sorry, premier. I'm sorry, premier. But something is happening in the country at that time. The white American tourist John Jurezek is shot. Roy Mason and Desmond Trotter, two members of the movement for New Dominica who are now Rastafarians, are arrested. They're both St. Mary's Academy boys. And the case is Regina versus Trotter and Mason. Trotter is represented by Grenadian attorney Morris Bishop, and Mason is represented rather by Dominican attorney Brian Arlene. Mason is acquitted. The prosecutor for the Crown is, I believe, one Eustace Francis. Mason is acquitted. Desmond Trotter is convicted and sentenced to be hung, sentenced to hang. And the cry goes up, free Desmond Trotter. People believe it's a frame up. And the government passes in 74, after the killing of Jurezak, the Prohibited and Undesirable Societies Act, which this year, Brother OJ, is 50 years extant, because 74, 2024, 50 years. How did that act and the killing of young people with dreadlocks lead to the diminution in support for the Labour Party that then led to 79? Talk about that.
Well, first of all, it was a moment of reflection as to whether the Labour Party was really representing the interests of the, put it this way, the less fortunate. And
Jaffa Malewe, the children of the less
Maliwe,
fortunate.
yes, the less fortunate. The pressure built up, but I believe that whilst that was ongoing, Eugenia Charles herself was not directly opposed in any strong way to the intent to put some control over what they think was at the time the evolving attitude of the Rasta movement to misbehaving. And that brings us to something which I've noticed, that there's a song going on about Puyon Koko. And that's the song, the theme song that's being played for today's activity in Grand Bay. And I thought it was unfortunate that that legacy of Patrick is being reconstructed in a negative way, when in fact I was Minister of Agriculture.
Yeah.
And our problem then was that the number of uh, uh, persons with their gardens in the various parts of Dominica who couldn't even go to their gardens, and whose food was being taken, whose production was being taken by
Pretty
this.
last name. Pretty last name.
That's what I'm saying. I'm just coming to that. So it was then decided by the technical people, both the police and the technical people at the Ministry of Agriculture, that there should be a predial larceny act, which the intent of which really was to ensure that there is less activity, put it this way, of an illicit nature, illegal nature, to take away the hard-working production of the farmers, the peasantry, and so on. Unfortunately, because of the way in which the act was written, it does give leeway to that one coconut. But the intention was not to attack the person who take a coconut, because as we know in Dominica, taking a coconut or a mango or something of that sort from another person's lands is neither here nor there. It is not supposedly a serious matter.
Yeah.
But
we talked about the gardens and so on, and that we used to do
that was normal.
Yeah.
But what happened then was Nassif became the focal point, where he wanted retribution for anyone who engaged with taking anything away from his estate. And so there was a pursuit to ensure that nobody did. And so that's where Chubby ended up in that story that he found himself in. And
Chubby is, of course, the singer in the Midnight Groovers.
Midnight
and
Groovers,
Grell
yes.
was in the independence movement. They both got arrested for
Right,
larceny.
for predial larceny. And that was very unfortunate. But let us read it back to where it belongs on a social level. The less fortunate people of Dominica who had their products taken, like coconuts, like mangoes, like avocados, nobody really got that attention deserving of prison. It became one where when Nassif became involved, because of his so-called influence and his economic status, and because of
And you're
who he
talking about
represented,
Elias Nassif, who had Jennifer
Elias
Estate,
Nassif, yes.
and he also had Dominica Coconut Products, which was the biggest foreign exchange earning way owned by Dominica, other than Elrose. They were
Right.
exporting soaps and so on.
Right.
And he also had a store in town next to the old market,
That's
which
right.
is now the ruins. And
Right.
because of that law, the people in Grand Bay rose up and they burnt down parts of the estate and they burnt the store in town. Is that correct?
You are very correct. But I would like to add a little bit more to it, because it's the question of privilege, you know. I'm not sure that if Grell Sui had taken a coconut from one of his fellow peasants, that would have attracted the attention of the police. And
Yes,
that's why
yes.
I'm going with this.
That's
And
very interesting.
in fact, later on, we found out that there was an audaciousness where a Nassif person became a minister of government to become lodged in our cabinet at $1 a year, which I found was reprehensible and disrespectful.
You mean that is the grandson of Elias Nassif?
That's correct.
Before
And then,
Nassif.
and followed by that, becoming a minister goes into the National Development Corporation and changes the entire concept of what the NDC is all about by Invest Dominica and removing persons who have been contributing to that organization, of which I was part of for about 10 years, by the way.
Okay.
As the representative of the Hotel Association for 5 years, and the UWP appointed me as the chairman of the NDC from 1995 to 2000 until he left office. And during that time came things
because
like
you own the hotel at Hatton
the Floral
Garden.
Gardens, yes.
Floral Gardens, yes.
Yes, which is a founder. I was a founder member of the new Dominica Hotel and Tourism Association. Before that, it was sort of a bourgeois-based hoteliers of Eugenia Charles and other people like Nassif and others who owned the hotel association. And a group of us got together and we decided we should expand it to call it the Dominica Hotel and Tourism Association. And as a consequence of that, also we formed an organization called the Eco Insights and Services Organization, which really was the organization for the indigenous hoteliers, the Papillot, the Hummingbird Inn, Chef Ilia, and all the other small hotels. But I will just come back to Nassif again, because here was this man who came in and he removes very important, credible people like a Henry lady who was well qualified. You had a Fidel young man who was well qualified. You had Ophelia Marie who was well qualified. You
You talk
have
about Michael Fidel,
That's correct, Michael Fidel. You had
Grandfather
Ophelia
Henry.
Marie. You had a young lady, what's her name? Henry. I can't remember her first name
Is
now.
it Valda? Is it Valda Henry?
No, Valdez, other sister. I'll tell you the name in a minute.
Athenia?
Athenia Henry, and who also became um, and Mary Jose Edwards.
Yes.
So all of those persons that were really the structure of what this NDC was about was removed, and the idea of the National Development Corporation, which led us into the Festival Commission and the Creole Fest of 1996, of which, as the representative of the DHTA on the board, were able to present this to the NDC as a way of increasing the bodies in the beds. And
so you're saying to me that the National Development Corporation was dismantled in removing people who were nationalists, who were interested in local culture, local industry, local ownership, and that was replaced by a philosophy of foreign control of the industrial commanding heights of the economy.
Absolutely. And more than that, and what is even more important than that, is that people keep on getting confused about how is that Creole Festival came about. I mean, we had, Gordon Henderson, who was like the ambassador, as it were, with the tri-states in New York. You also had him with Guadeloupe and Martinique promoting and so on. But people like Marie and others who played a part are ignored.
And of course, my brother there, Eddie Toulon.
That's correct. And your brother Eddie Toulon came in, though, in the year following, when the Festival Commission was formed.
Yeah.
Almost a year after the first Creole Festival.
Yeah.
And he became the leader by way of an appointment as executive secretary to the Creole, to the Festival Commission.
Yeah.
But persons who were involved with the Creole Festival really included other people, like a fellow called Stanley Georges, whose name is not mentioned at all, who was in charge of putting the coordination together, and so was Estrie, was his secretary.
Yeah.
And there were other people who were involved, including, like I just said, our dear friend Ophelia Mari, who was also involved. And he recalls, and in fact, in a message he sent me recently, he recalls when I came up from the executive office meeting, that I told him that it is done, that we had got the Creole Festival approved. And the United Workers' Party have to be given all the necessary recognition for having given the funding to set up the first commission's exposure of the Creole Festival. But then Nassif came in after that and changed the whole picture in 2000, right thereabout. And the NDC now became a different type of animal. And
yes.
the investment aspect for the local hoteliers was lost.
Before you go on there, I'm sorry, go ahead.
To the extent that this CBI program that you see going on, where you have five-star developments taking place here, there, and everywhere else, with persons who are not normally associated with tourism, have left behind, and that's a critical point I'm about to make, have left behind the Simses, the Ophelia, the Chair Ophelia, um,
Indigenous hoteliers.
the indigenous hoteliers, many of whom can be mentioned, including, of course, that which belong to Anchorage and Papillot and all the others, who could have been funded to restructure their loans at the aid bank, which, by the way, most of them are delinquents there, and create an environment of development of the indigenous hotel process and to live closer to the idea of the green tourism that we've been talking about, the nature island concept.
So you're saying to me that the philosophy of the E.O. Libla and the early Labour Party of protecting the rights of the local beaches for Dominicans, protecting the rights to the land through the Alien Landholding Act for local Dominicans, that philosophy of national development focused on indigenous Dominicans has been lost.
Absolutely, to the extent that, let me just assure you of this. When we look at land reform, when you do your research, which I'm sure you have done, there was a moment in time, somewhere about the 40s and early 50s, when 80% of the arable lands and estates belonged to about 10% of the population. Then when Brother Afi Martin took on the
Gist industries.
no,
Castle
no,
Bruce.
went to Castle Bruce and took on it wasn't GIS, it was CDC, that's correct.
Commonwealth
CDC,
Development Colonial Development Corporation.
that's correct. And then, of course, followed by what we saw in Geneva, and of course, other places came on board. Let me just assure you that that concept went well with the principles of the Labour Party, that the lands of the country belongs to the people of the country, the indigenous population. And when I became the Minister of Agriculture, I continued that process with a very aggressive land reform policy, which
Can you tell
included
the listeners what happened to the big estates that CDC owned at Castle Bruce, that NASIP owned at Geneva under the Labour administration?
those estates were acquired by government and redistributed to the people who were the peasantry, who were the workers on the estates, and consequently, most of the owners of the lands that were owned by these former leaders of the industry and of the commerce and of the land estate ownership concept, having been given to the people in turn were able now to plant crops and so forth and send their children to college and in some cases universities. And that was a transformative period of Dominica. Let me just talk about myself.
But Brother OJ, just so we can give it structure, because I have to go back a little bit, but let's just go through. CDC, the Colonial Development Corporation, government acquired it, redistributed the land to the peasants. River Estate, owned by the Shillingfords, government acquired it, built a housing estate for the working class. Am I correct?
Yes.
Geneva, the government acquired it and redistributed that to the peasant farmers. Am I correct?
You're right.
Bath Estate, government acquired that from Elrose and Company and redistributed that land in way of housing estate, which was the major housing estate at Bath Estate, and it was built by Dominicans, not Chinese. Am I correct?
Absolutely. Very correct.
And so what you saw then is with regard to Geneva, Castle Bruce, River Estate, I guess I can mention Picard as well.
Well, okay. So let's
all of those estates were acquired and redistributed to the working classes.
Let me go further than that. So I consider a legacy for me personally, within the realm of the politics that many people haven't recognized or understood, is that Picard was acquired. Mont Prosper, Wat Noueven, Trafalgar, Belleville Chopin, the Shawford area, Layou, in the Layou area, Marigot, we had lands there. The lands there, the Londonderry area. And I could continue, Chance at Portsmouth. and I mentioned PCAD before. These were all acquired during my term as Minister of Agriculture.
Was Geneva and Lagos and River State as well?
River State came before my term.
Okay.
Geneva was before my term.
Okay.
Castle Bruce was before my term. But all the others I mentioned was during my term. That is Bellevue Chopin. And the interesting part there is that, for example, in the case of Mont Prosper and Wharton Waven, the Eugenia Charles government came in and they decided that those lands had to be given back to the Rolls.
So those lands were from the Rolls, which is a very
the Roll
French
family. Yes.
The Roll family.
That's right.
Old French land
those
owning family.
There was a court case. And who represented the peasantry there? People from Mount Prosper, Wharton Waven, happened to be Babs Dyer, who happened to be in freedom at one time. Mm-hmm. And the person who he has opposed to was Ronan David. Matter go to the court. And the court ruled in favor of the people having got the land through acquisition in a normal way. And what has happened since then is that a very important aspect of our tourism, which is the sulfur baths and so forth in Mont Prosper, owned by Wharton Waven, owned by the people of Dominica, the grassroots peasantry, are now the owners of those establishments as a consequence of those acquisitions. And in fact, the same thing can be said about Kayambuk of Marigot, where they got lands in that region as acquired by me at that time. The same can be said where Bellevue Chopin government just built some houses up there. And that was also done by my administration. So I followed.
And when you say my administration, you meant at that time you're the minister responsible for lands.
For agriculture at the time. Yeah. And so we also had a very, very vigorous effort towards land distribution from Crown lands in places like the wet area in Bells, in other areas in the Wesley and the Marigot area. In fact, the very lands, we're coming to a very, very sensitive part for me, which is emotional. The very lands that were acquired or distributed rather as Crown lands, during my term of office under something called the Land Management Authority, LMA, that nobody talks about. The people there received their lands from government, and today those lands are being taken. But what is the worst? By government, by the government of today. And these lands that's now being taken includes beach areas. The concept for me would be, does beach also come into the picture of an airport per se? Who then will own those beach properties that people are told to leave and then told to go up to the mountains? A similar thing happened with PCAD. Lands that we had acquired in PCAD for the people of the estates of Gist at PCAD were given to those Dominicans or persons from Portsmouth in the hills. Eugenia Charles, when she came in, they released the beach properties, the beach lands of PCAD. And today they are owned by the doctors, be it Sorrento, be it Grell, be it this one, that one, the other, and the Nassifs. So how is it that the privileged people of the past generation ends up with the lands on the beach, and the persons from Portsmouth end up getting the lands on the upper side?
So let me ask you this question. OJ, are you saying to me, Mr. Prime Minister, that the Labour Party has lost its way?
I would say that as far as land reform is concerned, they've lost their way there.
Yes.
Because the concept for us who came into the struggle in the earlier years was based upon a very simple idea: Dominica for Dominicans.
Yes. So it was a nationalist, socialist perspective.
Precisely. Let me give you another example. The same land that was taken in Soufrière from the estate, one second, please. The same land that was taken by government, by my government, 79, of Soufrière estates, all of a sudden we end up with those foreigners one killing each other and all that kind of thing. Question for
Stop
me is,
right there. Stop. Mr. Prime Minister, are you saying that the land that you acquired for land reform for the working class and peasantry was given to that guy Snyder, who is now under arrest for killing the French Canadian Daniel Langlois and his girlfriend or partner Dominic Marchand?
I'm saying that lands, I'm not too sure of the specific locations, but I'll tell you this, that lands were taken um, from the El Rosen Company. That is where Sam Raphael have his place there as well, which is what they call his hotel,
Jungle Bay.
Jungle Bay, and that area, and other lands in the area to the Glow Show area, and so on, and other portions of land up on the hills overlooking the sea. Those lands were taken by government in 79 for the purpose of distribution. Similarly, some lands of Archibald and other such persons in the Point Michel area was taken for that purpose. So there was a very aggressive, dynamic effort to ensure that lands of the people was for the people, Dominicans.
Let me ask you this question because of what you just said. Are you saying to me that in the 24 years of this Labour administration, you have not seen the growth of a local business class that is Dominican?
I am saying that if you look at the sectors, let's take, for example, the hospitality sector, and you do research on it, you'll find that Papillot in Trafalgar is no longer the Papillot ownership that it used to be. I think they've passed on some aspect of it to rent to someone because they couldn't sustain the economic costs. You look at Exotica of Afi Martin, the similar situation. You look at Hummingbird Inn, that was demolished by hurricane, same situation, owing the aid bank. The same thing goes for Evergreen Hotel. That's on just living by a beer effort of some foreign young man. And the same will also be said of the Anchorage Hotel, which is barely surviving. And if you want to make us, Floral Gardens, which I own, was destroyed by two levels of unfortunate situations. One, wrongful acquisition by the government, and for which there's a court matter which has been resolved, and hence I am very concerned that I don't say more than I should at this point, particularly as it pertains to the question of payments due to us. And in addition to that, we would look at any other hotel you could think about that was indigenously owned. There was a generation ago, 24 years before, when 80% of the hotel plants were owned by local Dominicans. I venture to say that if you have to look at the present hotel stock in Dominica, it may just be 10%, if 20.
So you're saying that you're seeing the impoverishment, you're seeing the marginalization, you're seeing the destruction of a local hospitality sector that is owned by indigenous Dominicans.
Absolutely. There was a paper that was written by us when I was at the NDC, which sought to allow the United Workers' Party government to look into the possibility of refinancing of the hotel sector through the aid bank as a consequence of the fact that 90% of those persons who had borrowed money from the aid bank for the hotel development program were falling into some liability because of a number of factors. The inability of government to sustain the movement of people into the country through airline services and so forth. And also the persons themselves who had put in sweat equity, but the rate for which interest was at 12% and 10% and so on was extraordinarily high. And every effort was made to ensure that you protect the indigenous hoteliers. That's not happening.
Okay. We've been, very thankful for the work you did. I want to take the opportunity here for posterity to salute you, sir, for your tremendous work in land reform, which allowed for ordinary indigenous Dominicans to have a stake. And we hope that this recording here when it is listened to by others, may provide guidance for future generations to see how we can recoup that which we've lost. But knowing that time is against us in that we've been on for a bit, I want to go into 1975 and tell me what it was like to be a minister of government in the pre-independence, the last pre-independence cabinet led by Patrick John. How was that experience?
It was an exciting moment. I was, in fact, the Minister of Housing, Communications, Works and Housing, and had the responsibility. It was at a time when the political activity of a government through cabinet was that each minister of government was responsible for his ministry and did not have to report to an individual leader, but report to the cabinet, utilizing, as it were, the technical officers that you have available to you, the resources of that ministry, by the way of the ideas pool that will come about from the experts that come from the ministry.
So you're saying to me you didn't have a one-man band government?
We didn't have that. In fact, the responsibility of each minister was to provide information to a cabinet based upon the resources of that cabinet. That's the way it was supposed to be done. That's the idea way it's supposed to be done.
Do you get the impression that that's how Dominica is being run today?
It is clear that there's a diversion from that approach, obviously. And I'll give you an example. It is very imperative that we understand that when we talk about Patrick John, for example, there was the question of the bank, the National Bank, that was created. But the minister, Vic Rivera, was hands-on. It basically was a baby that he was given birth to in the cabinet of Patrick John. So Patrick John then will take responsibility for the success or failure as the leader of the cabinet. But Vic Rivera is the one who was dealing with the bank. So was the case with O.J. Seraphine on a number of fronts. One, the exciting moments of 200 houses at Bath Estate and 150 other houses in Canefield. I had to negotiate through my ministry because the ministry itself is the one that knew the various configurations to determine who built what in the ministry itself by way of...
Stick a pin in that because this is very important. Now that we see apartments going up in Dominica, no garden, no privacy, built by Chinese and other foreigners. Can you tell Dominicans who will come after this tape is on, after we've passed on, who built the houses at Bath Estate and the other housing estates at River Estate when you were there? Who are the contractors, masons, electricians, carpenters?
I wouldn't be able to give you the exact precise names, but I'll say that they are 100% Dominicans in both instances. And for there are other houses that were built in places like Kingshill, in Marigot, Point Michel. That was under my earlier term when Liebler had appointed me as the chairman of the Central House and Planning Authority in 1970. And also the distribution of lands at Ems Hall for the construction of houses by people and their resources. I also got the Royal Bank housing program right opposite the 200 houses of Patrick John's administration, of which I was the minister for housing. But as prime minister, I got the Royal Bank housing program, which people don't seem to even know about or recall or whatever, right across the street, going into the river area at the back. And everybody built their houses through the resources of the state by way of employment of people from the state.
And when those houses were built, Mr. Prime Minister, can you tell the listening audience whether the persons who built those houses or had those houses built for them had title in fee simple absolute?
They did. In fact, the Royal Bank housing program across the street from the CDB housing program, of which I was the minister, but I became PM of the RBC, is considered to be a model in that there was negotiations with the bank on terms that were favorable, and the people were able to build on top of what was given to them by an expanded version of the houses that they initially had. In other words,
stick a pin in this, Mr. Prime Minister, because this is important. So they were given a base house, the best design. And
Right.
most of them were able to expand, go up 2, 3 stories, some of them.
That's right. Absolutely. The whole idea was to have built a basic house that you could afford at the time. And as your money expands, your increasing of salaries and benefits would come about, then you'd put in the extra room. That was the concept. And the idea was that local Dominicans would be employed. And more than that, people had to tender. And that is the critical point. You tender
Stick a
based
pin, stick
upon,
a pin, stick a pin in that, Mr. Prime Minister. Are you saying to me that in the Dominica of your administration, the rules of procurement and public tender were open, transparent, and accountable?
absolutely. So we could be able to quantify the costs each person was tendering for and the ability and conclude what's best for the state. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Mr. Prime Minister, you're aware of what's happening now with these apartments built by Montreal management company out of Dubai, owned supposedly by Mr. Mohammed Abdullah. Is that in compliance with the record of the Labour Party as you knew it, sir?
Well, the Labour Party, as I knew it, was of a particularly different nature, for the reason being that we were people motivated and people responsible. In other words, it was intended to ensure that the little man walked tall. That was one aspect of what we did. There was the other one, which was all shall eat. And that was a concept.
Oh, by the way, it
And
was not wasn't some shall it all.
your words. Your words. But I'll stay according to the Calypsonian. I'll bat in my crease.
I understand. I
Yeah.
understand. I understand you've
Okay.
got some, yes.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I
But
know,
but but but, but I think though that I have the authority. I
yes,
have the authority as a statesman, the authority of my age, and the authority of my experience to talk the truth.
of course.
Because I was looking at something which came out in a quotation that I was preparing for you. It said, "Part of the happiness of life consists not in fighting battles, but in avoiding them masterly. Retreat is in itself a victory,"
Yes.
which is what I just did.
Yes, I
But
did. That's what,
yeah, but then you know, as the historian, there is this that was said too, that the goal of the historian must be fearless, which is what you're doing,
yes, indeed.
not corrupted, free,
Indeed.
the friend of truth and of liberty,
Indeed.
who calls a fig and a skiff, neither giving or withholding from anyone any favor or enmity or influenced by pity or remorse. So
Indeed.
you're doing just that, you
And I
know?
have to, because you, as you know, we have not even got into the questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask about a few people that you knew better than me at my early age. A gentleman by the name of Wendell Mackenzie Christian, firefighter, soldier before that, who was your client and customer, and someone who in 1977, when the strike took place, under your government, was the only firefighter officer to remain on duty. According to, he told us till the day he died, he held the fort and trained the police and the defense force to man the fire service. Tell me your impressions of that man.
A gentleman, a man of dignity, not because he is related to you, I'm saying so, but everyone who knows him know that he stood up as a soldier even when he became a fireman. He was a person that one looked at, he had this easy smile. He was always considerate, calm, cool, and collected. I have never seen him, and I knew him well. I've never seen him expressing any venom of any kind, and even whatever disappointments he may have. And I always thought that he should have been higher up in the ranks than he was. because he demonstrated that confidence, that air of authority that would have established him as being a leader of the department that he worked at.
You know, it's interesting that you said that. You know, Watchfield Douglas, the brother of Bruce Douglas, tells me that their father, RBD, taught them cream must float. As with you, because you're still floating, he was the de facto chief on many an occasion, not because he was there by relationship to his brother or by title, but as a matter of fact, Brother OJ, I will tell you that most Dominicans, when they think of him, consider him to have been the chief.
Yeah, he did appear to be the chief. He behaved like one. As to why he didn't make it at a time when one would think that there was a government that would have been more sympathetic to people of his ilk coming from where he came from. It didn't quite work out that way, but that's how it is. You know, we are not always given what belongs to us.
There's another woman that was.
Even as we speak, let me just, before this moment is lost, as that mind of mine just refocused on something. It is interesting that you and I are having this conversation because you may not know it, but I've held you in very, very high esteem as an activist, as an intellectual, as a fervent controller of your being as it pertains to situations that could cause persons who are not well structured to get angry, like what occurred with your brother and the various strange, bizarre accidents that he got through in Port Michel, and the way in which, you know, your desire for growth and development have been held back, particularly when it comes to the Cadet Corps and even some of your initiatives and some of your investment opportunities that you thought could have gone forward. But you've remained steadfast. And I think that when you came on board with the Democratic Labour Party as a young man, where you were part of a process of change. And as I reflect even now on those persons who are still active and their voices are loud, like Lawa Alexander, who was Paul Alexander, who was my representative in Grand Bay, or like the Brains, who is on this other radio station, who was also part of my program, and people like Felix Thomas was also part of this, as well as Roy Williams was also a candidate, and yourself. So I look back and I said, but you know, after all, you didn't choose bad people at all to be or bad people or good people somehow got into your orbit. And I just want to add this before I forget it, because what people don't understand was that when Patrick John fell on the 29th of May, you'd like to go to that sometime, I suppose, but time is running. Yeah. When he got affected by situations which had reason for concern by the citizenship, there was even more concern within the cabinet itself, of which I was part of. And we released our way of expressing ourselves within the cabinet. Unfortunately, we're not heard the way we should have been heard. But when Patrick is about to fall,
well, I was going to get there, so can you let me do it the way I think?
Yeah, well, that's not a problem. I just thought that time was passing.
Yes, so I wanted to say to you, so you've talked about land reform. I'm going to ask one more question because this is the 50th anniversary of the Dread Act. One question, Prime Minister, how could the government of the day have handled the issue of predial larceny and the dreads a little differently?
I don't quite see too much of predial larceny having been as much an issue as was being described. It is just, like I said, unfortunate that the powers that be, the police officers and so on, could have been more discretionary based upon what exactly are they trying to control. The law is passed, but the intent by Patrick John, as far as I know, and myself as Minister of Agriculture at the time, was not to go and look for every young man who has a coconut in his hand. The intent was to ensure...
Or who had dreadlocks to try to cut it.
Or dreadlocks or any such thing, because that was not the attack point. The attack point was to protect the farmers who were producing stuff, couldn't go to their farms, and also had their products being stolen and taken away as soon as it appears that it's ready for sale. So there must be a response to that. We must understand that. And in fact, to give Patrick credit, when it came to things like Mountain Dew, which is the illicit rum making process in Mont Prosper, I recall distinctly there were times when the police would be going to Mont Prosper to find the persons who were involved with processing that illicit rum. And Patrick called the chief in my presence, in my knowledge, saying that it is unfair that these people are trying to make a living, and people who want the illicit rum just cast a blind eye on that. And the police chief at the time said that he should, in fact, change the law. And he promised to do that. So I can't recall if that law was ever changed. It's a possibility it could have been. But what he did do, however, was to stand on behalf of those persons who may have been doing something illegal to ensure that they were able to get a living. So I don't think there was any kind of hostility from Patrick himself to ensure that the poor people or rastas or dreadlock people or whoever it is would be imprisoned for drinking a coconut jelly. That was not the plan. So it is unfortunate that the song that is being played today is about Pouyon Coco, as opposed to another very popular song of Chubby, which is Milk and Honey.
Yes.
I would have thought milk and honey would be more relevant.
I see. Let me ask you this question, because we're coming to 79, but before 79, in 78, we're leading up to independence, and the Freedom Party is asking for a referendum. And the student movement, of which I'm then the president of the Federation of Students, we are supporting through the Popular Independence Committee, the independence movement based on Patrick John's declaration at Salisbury. How do you look at the role of Rosie Douglas, the Popular Independence Committee, and the student movement of our time in its support for independence of the Commonwealth of Dominica?
Well, let me just say this much. I think that the youth movement, led by you and Pascal and others like that, who were involved with it together with Rosie, and I dare say persons like Bernard Wiltshire and
Charles,
were themselves, it's like an organization that came together. The educational program of Bernard, together with Rosie and yourself and others, did leave us into a very awesome moment of youth in action. You're talking about people in their 20s, like, well, you're just late teens, you're in your teens, and the others were in their early 20s, and they took up the fight, including Rosie, and the others who were involved. It was a group, a feeling, an energy, a new awakening that young people can talk and move forward and decide on their destiny. And that was
why do you think the young people in Dominica today are not that active?
Because of what you said earlier. They're not active because they're not in cadet corps, they're not into 4-H club, they're not into Boy Scout and whatever. They're not structured in their minds to evolve and to grow and to evolve to a point where they can take responsibility. I remember when I became a member of the Labour Party, like you, I was very young, because I followed the same way you followed early politics. I did the same. How many young people you find today who go to political meetings, if there are any? If there was a CEO, they would go. And so we have changed the whole concept, the culture.
And when you say CO, you're referring here now to the new culture of jump up and carnival and so on at meetings.
That's what it is. And so people.
So the whole idea of debates and panel discussions, so on, that has gone by the wayside.
Yeah, well, because we'll remember, like, persons like give credit to where credit is due. I mean, Maynard and Michael White and all those persons like that, Alec Lazar and so on, who formed the Daubeny Debating Society. And M&D, Movement for New Dominica, and so on. They were structured not to become hostile to a political party per se, but they were structured to determine where a future for Dominica should be. And if we will agree, the reality was that we formed the Empire Club after left um, academy and grammar school. I was one of the leaders there, become the president of that club. And many of the young men, whether it be Irvin Shillingford or Grayson Shillingford or the Latigs and a number of other sports people joined into that organization, Empire Club. The next president of that club was Edison James. And what did we do? We had civic studies. We had persons like bank managers and persons of resource like Telford Shillingford and other people like that who'd come in and talk to us about elevating ourselves in a certain direction.
How old are you at that time, OJ? I mean, Prime Minister.
I was about Empire Club. I was about 20, 21, thereabout.
Very young.
Very young. Edison James was the same. And Edison left, went overseas, and he came back, he became Prime Minister. So it's that structure I'm talking about.
So you're saying you're cultivating the mind. You're constantly, because I mean, you spoke to me earlier about Dale Carnegie, Napoleon Hill. I mean, those are names that even today in management studies, in the idea of mind over matter, in the idea of success principles are still very current.
Right. Very, very current because it speaks to something which is mind dynamics. How do you structure your mind? Whatever the mind can conceive and believe the mind of man can achieve and so on. Success is given by those who keep on trying, do it now, that type of thing. So you learn those things and it becomes part of you, I remember learning those and then I realized, well, there's a power within me that I could express and a confidence.
That's right.
And so at grammar school, just to go back quickly, just jump over that quickly, I was made the house captain of Benedict Joseph House.
That's my house.
Oh, your house. There we go. And so leadership
Did you know him?
What's that?
Did you know Benedict Joseph?
I knew him. He was Dora Benjamin's brother, and his father was a photographer.
Yes.
In King George V Street.
And what happened to him? I was told he went to a party or beach.
Yeah,
outing.
he died early, and for whatever reason, Archer liked him a lot, and decided to call this house on his name. And that's about 60, 70 years, about 60 years ago, right? Almost.
More than that, because that was before I was born.
Yeah, okay. And that's right. It's about.
So we're talking.
About 70-something years ago.
Close to 70 years ago, because I was told that he was at grammar school and he went to a beach outing and drowned or something.
Yeah. He had a death situation, which is unfortunate. And our childhood liked him a lot, decided that we should name the house after him. So I'm saying that leadership begins from the beginning. My question is, how many young leaders do we have that's emerging without having to become sycophants or gullible or subjected to influence type of thing? How many people can stand on their 2 feet and feel comfortable in their own skin? How many of them have fathers like your father and my father who had full dominant energy to transfer the fact that you belong to your place? You're not subjected to another man, that you're as good as you want to be, by the definition of understanding that there's qualities within you. And then you move on to the next level, which I've done in my more mature life, which is to experience a spiritual awakening, that there is a life that is controlled not by a man, but by the upper power.
Indeed.
How do you resort to that? At the God power factor, which in my very, very early youth, I didn't have. But as I grow along, I realized, but wait a while, there's so much I can accomplish by just subjecting myself to that power.
And so cultivation of the mind, yes.
That's correct. You have to have a power besides yourself. Who are you fighting for, or what are you fighting with? And so the man who supposedly is in charge of things is just a breath away. And so How do we get our children and our young adults to understand that they did not subject themselves to that so-called power of man, but that they have the ability, if they stay focused, to achieve that which you have achieved?
Indeed.
Because you came from that family, and today, who are you? And your
Well,
children, who are they? And so on.
let me ask you. There's a woman whose home you came to when I was a child to sell insurance to. Her name was Alberta Christian. She became the director of the School for the Blind and brought the blind from the darkness into light of self-reliance, making things to earn a living. She's 94 going on 95. Your impression of that woman who you'd have known when she was maybe in her late 20s.
Elegant, confident, and someone who understands how to serve, and respected.
But she's a Red Cross volunteer as well, eh?
Yeah,
You know
she
that.
was highly respected. And so her energy, when you came into her zone of connection, was one that this is a lady, and that's a word that is very rare these days, being a lady. And so that's, if in a nutshell, if I don't have to go into too many words, by saying that, I think I've said what I would like to say about her.
Indeed. So it's now 1975. You're Minister Michael Douglas. Your memories of him.
Michael and I had some issues, but it all began with a simple thing. Patrick John, somewhere about 74, thereabout, I having become very close to him, Patrick John, as a result of my having worked vigorously to ensure he became the lead after LeBlanc, called on me to go to Portsmouth to find whether we could get an alternative to Earl Leslie, who was aging. And Michael Douglas' name came up, and he asked me to inquire, investigate as to whether Mike would suit the requirements of being a representative of the people, because there was some suspicion that he's a Douglas, another RBD, and all that kind of stuff. So I went to Portsmouth, and I found out that in the Glanvilla area, Michael was very popular. He was a man, nomte type of person. People appreciated him, and he had the gift of
And
the
for the
gab.
non-English speakers, Nomte means a man of the soil.
That's
Son
right.
of the soil. Yeah.
That's correct. And he drank and so on. He was very social. And when he became the representative of Portsmouth, he took on not then a Douglas persona to win the election. He took on the Labour Party's persona, which is LeBlanc, followed by Leslie, and people like Emmanuel Martin and others, who had dominated the politics and had won against Barron and Old Man Douglas and so forth in the past. So Labour Party then was the dominant party, and he came off on that benefit. He assumed upon himself having become a representative, and there were reports that he was not very friendly to Patrick John's image, and that he was not very, put it this way, responsive to the agenda of Patrick per se, that he was a person who wanted to take over, as it were. And there were reports coming to Patrick and so on, and there was someone who, yeah, he was not sharp, and the phone was exposed to what he was saying, and Patrick heard it, and Patrick warned me, see what you did, bring this man from, look at what the man's saying, and that type of thing. It took a little while before Patrick decided, 1 year after 75, into 76, decided that he's going to remove Douglas from the Ministry of Agriculture, Lands, Fisheries, and Cooperatives, because it happened to be a ministry where the presence of that minister with the electorate would become established, because of course we are an agricultural country. He was brought down to the Ministry of Common Works, and then it was housing. And Patrick says to me that, listen, I'm not going to leave housing with this man because you have been negotiating with the CDB, and we now have the money to build those houses. He will take all the praise. I am going to take it under my ministry, the housing ministry, and I'm going to make you the chairman of the housing corporation. So I became Minister of Agriculture and chairman of Housing Corporation. So I could continue being the minister in charge. As to why Patrick didn't make me the minister, in addition to agriculture and fisheries and corporate, I believe he probably thought it would be too top heavy for perception. But he took it, but I did the work. And so Douglas now entered as the Minister of Communication and Hydraulics of all things. And it was a rather sick humor, in a sense, ironical humor, that Patrick said that most of the vehicles and so on already CWNH emblazoned on them. And so consequently, he liked to leave the H, but he's going to jack up something and call it hydraulics. So he had fun doing that. It wasn't too long after that Patrick and Mike didn't have anything in common, and Mike was thrown out of the cabinet.
Because Mike, in 1978, both Michael Douglas and Ferdinand Parallel were thrown out because of a communist plot. What do you know about any communist plot?
I think the communist plot was an exaggeration. I don't think Parallel was involved in any communist plot. And I don't think there was any communist plot. There was probably a plot by Michael himself to see a way in which he could able to take over the country. In fact, Michael did the same to me in 1980. So after I became the leader of the Democratic Labour Party, he was very, very ambitious. And so using the communist plot was probably a very easy way to create some negativity surrounding the presence of Michael. But just to talk about that Democratic Labour Party and that potential communism and what happens.
Well, we're going to come there because I'm going to do 79, and then after 79, I'm going to do
all right. No
so
problem.
let's do 79. Let's do 78. 78, November 3rd, Independence of Dominica. You're there on the stage with Princess Margaret and Prime Minister then Patrick John. What are your expectations for Dominica?
The expectations for Dominica was huge, because just before we lead off into the total expectation, the work towards getting that independence in 78 was one where Patrick, Lee Austin, the Attorney General, Vic Rivera, and myself first went following the Salisbury Declaration and the efforts of people like yourself. I had been with Patrick going to England to inform the British. That's the first move that we made to the need for independence for Dominica, the fact that we intend to go in that direction. Later on, there were others who came forward when the whole thing was established, but we opened the door. When we came back at the Isilo Black Bridge, there was that massive crowd waiting for us that was set up by the Freedom Party to ensure that they expressed in no uncertain terms their disagreement of us going into independence. There was a joke in the matter as far as that is concerned, whereby Vic Rivera and Patrick and myself was informed by no less a person than I think Desiree, who called his wife, saying that there's a big crowd amassing at the Isilo Black Bridge. I, in my way of thinking, in a clever way, said, we can go up Santa Roma, go for the back, as you know, that road at the back of Bath Estate, and go for the Botanical Gardens, go to Mount Bruce, where we were living. Patrick declared that under no condition will anybody have him going for any back street to escape. If they want to do whatever they want to do, he will allow it to be done in the center of Roseau and let people see for themselves what is the opposition like. And so it was that when we got there into Roseau, there was that massive crowd. And the crowd were beat up on the vehicle, and there was a lot of aggression and people screaming and shouting and what have you. And I told Patrick, boy, you see what you caused us to be. I told you we could have passed at the back. He says, I'll tell you what, comrade, learn one thing with me. I don't run away from crowds. I face them, okay? But the most interesting, the most humorous part of it all was that Vic Rivera, who was with us coming in, had boasted that, boy, I have my gun, I'll stop off and pick up my gun at Mao, and so on. And when they come, they'll see who's afraid of who and whatever. By the time we reached Mao, and we stopped by Vic Rivera, he take off and he went to his house. And he left us to face that situation in Roseau. Anyway, and that's a backdrop to independence.
I understand.
So independence, therefore, for us meant an opportunity, a fresh opportunity to go international.
Yeah.
And that was where I thought we would have had the strength to be able to be disciplined and face opportunities where they existed. In those days, the ACP was very alive, African, Caribbean, Pacific countries, fighting on the behalf of sugarcane and prices for bananas and
citrus, and so
sugarcane
on.
and citrus and what have you. We thought that we could have used that opportunity as a leverage. We thought that we could have brought in our presence into the world out there, with the UN, OAS, and whatever else. And it just turned out that things went sour.
Let me ask you a few things. Sidney Bernard-Aline, did you know him?
Very well.
What kind of character was he?
I could simply answer the character.
Okay,
Okay, let me explain to you who Sidney Bernard-Aline was.
So for the persons who will be listening, Sidney Bernard-Aline was accused of a plot to invade Barbados and install Prime Minister Patrick John as Prime Minister of Barbados and Dominica, and he had been linked to mercenaries in the Congo, like Wild Mike Hoare and so on. And it really gave a very bad impression of the governance of the country at the time. So tell me how he came to be linked to our cabinet, and what do you know of him?
Sidney Bernard-Aline was introduced to Dominica through various ways, but one of which was that he came from the Porter's family. That is Portersville, which is on the northern side of Roseau. And so that family was his family. And he felt he was in fact involved with mercenary activity in Rhodesia and different parts of South Africa and so on during the struggle. And he came back to Barbados with an immense amount of gold and other jewelry that was immensely, put it this way, huge. And he formed the Sydney Mercantile Bank, which is a bank in Barbados. That story is interesting because it brings us to the fact that Patrick John had full confidence in one Lee Austin, who was the Attorney General.
From Guyana.
He's from Guyana. He was a teacher at the grammar school, by the way. One time he taught at the grammar school. And he decided that Lee Austin, decided to go into some relationship with Sidney Bernard-Aline outside of the cabinet. So a number of things started happening where, as you know, around that period of time, 77, 78, there was this movement of apartheid, the response to apartheid in South Africa. And so there's a letter which I have right before me right now as we speak. And in there was an offer that was being made by Sidney Bernard-Aline to Dominica through Lee Austin for an international airport and harbor facilities. And he says it is agreed that the fulfilling our common objectives with respect will create a sovereign balance that will always prevail, and words to that effect. But what it was simply saying was that Austin, in his own decision-making outside of the cabinet, had entered into negotiations with a fellow called Coetzee, Honorable G.J. Coetzee, Minister, Commercial, South African Embassy. And that, of course, was one of the biggest problems that I had when I found out about this through some means. And
well, you know, the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC Panorama program
did that
actually
as well.
exposed that.
Yeah. Yes. But before the Panorama program came out, that letter came to my attention. It's a lot of detail there, but what it simply was saying was that there was an arrangement being made with which Sidney Bernard-Aline was involved in order for us to build up a relationship to set up an oil refinery and an international airport and so on, and that it would be a hub for South African movements of aviation, which obviously completely contrary to all that we as a nation should be doing at a time when apartheid was being renounced by all nations of the world.
Yes.
So that brought Sidney into the picture. But even before this letter came out, Sidney Bernard-Aline had indicated that he was prepared to finance Dominica International Airport. And so when it comes to airport, there are lots of stories about airports. But one of the most important aspects of what Sidney Bennett Allen was offering was that he'd have used the finances of the gold bullion and other such things as a form of collateral to raise international loans for the purpose of the international airport. We had gone ahead and acquired lands in Woodford Hill on that basis. There were technical studies that were already mounted in Britain for the construction of the international airport. And I'll say something I've never said anywhere before. It is almost like something that comes out of a movie, where I was told by Sidney Bennett Allen, and acting on behalf of the government of Patrick John, was to have gone to Barbados and to move that gold bullion to a program in Dominica, to a protective area in Dominica, to use there from Dominica as collateral, by which Sidney Bennett Allen had made an arrangement with a minister of government of Barbados, because they have dual keys because of the fact that it is an offshore banking institution, and therefore the keys for that would have to be shared. One cannot go without the other. And that minister offered to assist Sidney Bennett Allen to remove that gold bullion. Air Martinique, the airline company that I was associated with before I left government, had a flight on the ground, which I traveled with, went to Barbados. And it was expected that Sidney Bennett Allen and the minister would have facilitated the movement of the money of the gold bullion into that aircraft. What father and minister disappeared the night to Florida and did not respond to Sidney Bennett, and he threatened to expose them, which he did. There was a letter of exchange of $1 million that he had given as fundraising to the government of the day, which was put in the newspapers when you do some research in Barbados, which was an exposure of what he had done for that particular minister. So
you're in Barbados waiting for $2 billion in gold, and it never arrives.
It never arrived because that was what the situation was. So then when later on Patrick John felt that he was being accused of being with Coetzee and with Austin, he felt that he was not only involved, that there were other people involved, which included obviously us truly, which he felt that I should take responsibility, which I'm sure that in the cabinet I did, that what was expected from Sidney Bennett Allen didn't come through. But sometime later, however, he went into this craziest thing that is Sidney Bennett Allen as it pertains to the potential takeover of Barbados and all of that.
But what I'm saying to you is, once you arrived in Barbados, the minister ran away, Sidney did not bring the gold. Did you not then report to Patrick John that this guy cannot be trusted?
Yes.
And what did Patrick John do?
Because the whole deal fell through, you know?
Yeah. But once you did that, did Patrick John say, yes, Mr. Seraphine, I'm going to take your word? Or did
No. We didn't have that kind of conversation.
Okay. So we're now at 79. There's a lift spot crisis. Then there's Don Pearson, who shows up with the free port, right? And there's the building opposition. The government then decides May 29th to pass the two laws. One for the press, one for the trade unions. The trade unions, the opposition, decide to demonstrate on May 29th. What does the cabinet do on the evening? Do you discuss it and say, well, let's shelve the two bills, or are we going to go through with it and see what's going to happen?
Very interesting you asked that question, because what transpired then was there was no knowledge whatsoever that there was going to be, by the Ministry of Agriculture, that is, that there was going to be anything to do with that 45 square mile, whatever it was. That was not part of our arrangement within the ministry. And as you know, in those days, the ministry was always the one that directs whatever happens within the concept of the ministry. So lands were supposed to have been one where lands were supposed to have been under the control of the Ministry of Agriculture. And so as a result of that, it was expected that there would have been communication with technical staff as to the raison d'etre for such an activity. And it turns out that as time went by, we discovered that there was communication on the ministry of the Chronicle, which said that there was a 45 square miles to be taken for the purpose of a free zone.
And just so the record will reflect what we're talking about the Freeport Authority led by one Don Pearson from Texas. That would be the 45% of the north of the island. I think from almost the third northernmost portion of the island. And you're saying to me that you did not know about that.
At the time, we did not know. So when I found out about it through cabinet, not a cabinet, expose on the Chronicle.
The newspaper, the Dominica
On the
Chronicle.
newspaper, yeah. And so my permanent secretary brought it to my attention, Early Castor, saying, do you know about that? Because he's the permanent secretary, he didn't know about it. And so I called a meeting of the various persons involved in the ministry, the chief agricultural officer, the forestry officer, the permanent secretary, and of course, Eustace Francis was an attorney, and discussed what we saw. And we discovered that this 45 square miles included a couple of things that were to us not acceptable. One of which was that there'd be some security in that area, and that it'd be $1 a year. And so on those two conditions, I went to cabinet and suggested that what decisions was taken was not supposed to be accepted. The way it was written, the concept of a free zone and a free port is a good one, but those two were done. And then I was told that by the leader that, okay, if you know that that's how you feel, we will discuss this matter with Mr. Pearson and tell him to make the changes. And he was not prepared to do that, and the matter came to an end.
Okay, so that was Shell. And then we had May 29th.
Yeah.
Yes. So on the eve of May 29th, did you have a cabinet meeting to say to plan what was going to happen?
I wasn't there. I was sick, genuinely sick, and I was unable to be present to be part of whatever discussions took place.
So on the 29th itself, you were not in town at the parliament?
No, I was not.
Yes.
I was not. I didn't know anything about that particular matter because I was very ill. And I was at Bruce where doctors visited, and and there was some very acute situation that I was dealing with. But in fact and in truth, the reason why I resigned, and that's probably important.
You were the first to resign. Let the record reflect. So let the record reflect before you go any further. So when the shooting took place, could you hear it from the morning?
I can't recall hearing that at all. I was sick. I we up in Montrose. I was in a bad situation. In fact, my wife was told not to even sleep with me and so on because I had a particular illness. And so what transpired then was, having that bill placed was a decision of the government of the day, of Patrick Jonah, the Attorney General. But as far as I am concerned, my situation had nothing to do specifically to an end of me. My situation had to do with this BBC declaration of the events that were taking place
with South Africa.
South Africa. That was one.
And you didn't want to have anything to do with that.
Absolutely nothing.
Why was that, OJ? Why was that? Why did you not want to have to?
Well, for the reason that's obvious, because South Africa was a bête noire, in the international world, and their behavior as it pertains to what it took place there in terms of the apartheid movement, that was contrary to my thinking, and I expressed that as such. And then there was something to do with the offshore bank, which is an offshore bank that was there called the Federal Bank of Dominica, which I found out there was a branch in Dominica which we in cabinet didn't know. So based upon all of those things, the Prime Minister himself understood that was my position, that Lee Austin, who was really the lead on those things, he was the lead person. Patrick was just going along with his Attorney General in a very innocent way. But I was able to point out, and in the cabinet point out, that these are areas I couldn't respond to in a positive way. And I suggested that this man be removed. And I gave an ultimatum as to what I will do in the event that is not going to be removed, that I will resign. So it was within the ambit of the internal politics and dynamics of cabinet that my decision was made. It was nothing to do with the crowds out there and all the people out there. And
so that was just happening at the same time. It just happened to coincide.
Well, it coincided, yes. in the sense that because my resignation letter, which I have here, it was about the 2nd
Can
of
you read it? Do you mind if you have it? Can you read it? I'd like you to read it if you have it. Very important document.
Yeah, it is. It's public though. It was written in the Chronicle, and it says here, Seraphine resigns, and it reads as for it was either in the Chronicle or the Barbados newspapers, but I have a copy of it right here.
Sure. Okay.
And it says that the man regarded as the most respected minister of government of Prime Minister Patrick John Oliver Seraphine, Minister of Agriculture, Lands and CARICOM Affairs, has resigned from government. Below we publish the letter full of.
What's the date on that letter?
Letter to the PM. It was written on the June 1st, 1979.
Okay, June 1st. Okay, so
That's
that's about
within a day or two
yeah.
of the
Okay.
event
All
of
right.
29th of May.
Okay. When did you so basically the as let the record reflect the country shut down after the riot and the killing of Timothy and the shooting of 10 others. There's a general strike, the schools are closed, the airport's closed, and so on. There's some looting in Roseau and some blocking of roads in the countryside. H.L. Christian resigns. Before you talk about what happened with the Committee of National Salvation, give me your impression of H.L. Christian as a cabinet member and his contributions to Dominica.
Well, H.L. was known as a gentleman of the most respected level. He was someone that no matter how you looked and tried to construe, he stood by his principles. I recall when I got the first set of letters from a source that was very strange because I happened to be at my house and a number of letters were made available to me, which included the Bank of Dominica, which included the letter from Coetzee and Leo Austin of the South African and other things. And I brought it to his attention whilst Patrick was out of state. When I got it, I went to cabinet, and Mr. Christian listened, and he says, "You know what? If I believe that Pat is involved in this thing, I will resign." So I said, "Well, I don't think the Prime Minister himself is the person directly involved with those letters because they're signed by Leo Austin, and there was a transfer of funds and so forth that took place with the banks involved, and it was turned out that that information, when it was made to your uncle, he said that, I would not like to think that Pat is in this. And if he is, I shall resign. So later on, when Patrick came back from his trip overseas, he did say to me that if I had given any false information to the cabinet in his absence, then obviously the right thing to do is to resign. If I did anything that was not correct, I was not properly informed about. And that transpired, and your uncle stood by on this one. And then that was where the claim by the cabinet that Leo Austin should resign was strengthened by those letters. Turns out that Patrick didn't want to release Leo because, they had a certain friendship with him and understood him in a certain way that we didn't. And it was long after I resigned that Leo Austin was told to depart.
Yeah. So H.L. Christian resigns, you resign before him, Leo leaves, the Committee of National Salvation is formed, and the consensus is that you become Prime Minister.
Interesting. It's interesting because I did not expect to be in any government at that particular time, having resigned, because Patrick John had 16 seats. And I'm talking about it hadn't evolved into all the various activities that had transpired that caused many ministers to resign. That didn't come up at the time of my resignation. My resignation was based upon the principles of certain situations that had occurred with the Attorney General and therefore I didn't want to have any part of this. And I was out through the door with no intention of having any part to do with any government. I
But
was not part of. I didn't come to or visit any meetings that had taken place with the Committee for National Salvation.
but who approached you? Was it Ruzi or Mike who approached you?
I would say initially it was neither one nor the other. Mike eventually approached me, but it was a gentleman whose name I wouldn't mention right now because I would have to ask his permission to do so. But Eustace Francis was also the one who informed me that a meeting had taken place and that a decision was made. My question on that would be to say this. Why me? Because the Committee for National Salvation comprised of names that we should never forget in our history. They were Sheridan Gregoire, Dominica Employees Federation, Pamela Liebert, Social League, Anthony Joseph of Dawu, Louis Benoit of Wawu, Pierre Charles, Youth Council, who became a prime minister later, Percival Mary, CSA, Norris Charles, Dawu, Julius Sampson, Dominica Association of Industry and Commerce, Charles Maynard, Church Council, Norman Roll, Dominica Employees Federation, Lloyd Pascal, Youth Council, Rosie Douglas, NDAP, Bernard Nicholas, Dominica Trade Union, Father Huisman, Church Council, Eugenia Charles, Freedom Party, Milton Elwa, NW, Mike Douglas, LM, and Brian Allen, Freedom Party. So what we had there was the representative of 26 organizations of the country. Persons like yourself who are there, as very young person.
Yeah, we're part of the Federation of Students is part of the Youth Council. So I
Correct.
attended meetings and so on.
Right.
And the consensus was OJ was a clean one. He has not been seen as a brutal minister. He's a friendly guy. And he most likely is the person who can bring all Dominicans together. That was the sentiment within the commission.
Yeah. Well, but then that
Within the
sentiment
committee.
now had to be carried to another level because this committee of persons represented the nation, every conceivable organization of the nation was accepted in this council as representative of people that they represented. And so when it came about that I was being offered something like that, it was brought to my attention by Mike Douglas, for example, as one person, who said that there was a plan afoot to go to Juan Bruce to ensure that Patrick John had been given clear indications that he was no longer able to hold on to government. And Patrick John at the same time had a defense mechanism in place with the various sandbags and so forth outside his house in anticipation of the arrival of a mob. And there was a mob being planned to go up to him, And so it was of concern to me then that if there's no solution in sight that is able to sustain and prevent escalation.
Because basically what you're saying is after the shooting by the Defense Force under the command really of not Newton, Newton really was not much of an actor. Malcolm Reed himself discharged about 23 bullets from his 45 pistol. And several people were wounded by him. It seems that Philip may have been killed by a 303. They sandbagged the headquarters of the Defense Force on High Street there, and they sandbagged the Prime Minister's house, awaiting the mob. But that never happened because there was a soft landing facilitated by the Committee for National Salvation, because once they decided to offer you the position of Prime Minister, the other ministers were persuaded to vote for you.
Well, again, that's where we jump over another aspect of the formation of Democratic Labour Party. It was the formation of Democratic Labour Party that created the environment and the facilitation of persons who were with party to come to me.
Indeed. So who formed the Democratic Labour Party? Was it
I did. I did. I was a founder member of the party together with Eustace Francis.
So what you did, you called Eustace, and you and Eustace called the others.
Yes, and we had what you call a resolution that was put together. It's saying that in view of whatever because the
Yes,
document
yes.
has disappeared. But it was
Yeah.
basically saying that in view of the situation in the country, we need to get some resolution to that. Because um the the Committee for National Salvation was offering really was one that couldn't be transmitted into the parliament.
No, because they were not elected. They were an
That's the point I'm
unelected
making.
civil
Yeah,
organization. So basically,
right.
what you're saying for purposes of history is that the elected members, led by yourself and Justice Francis, on your initiative from the party, and with the party being formed, then you were able to go to parliament and they could vote for you as prime minister.
Precisely. I could get 11 plus out of
That's
the
correct.
21. And
And then
so
Patrick John
whilst
was
I was
there,
offered,
but he was
so the
out because he had
critical,
lost the
yeah,
confidence.
the critical point here is this, that whilst I was offered something by the leaders of Dominica, by the NDC, National Development Corporation, by the
Committee,
organization, yeah,
the Committee
we
for
were
National Salvation.
the Committee for National Salvation. Whilst I was being offered on as something that's on a platter, the reality is that when you look at the cabinet, the formation of the parliament itself, the except let's say remove Patrick, John, you have 20. Who are the other 20 persons who could have been met to meet a relationship of such that could redirect and change things into the way in which would cause some consensus to allow for a government to emerge? Because that government emerged as a result of the larger number of persons who had served as cabinet, as parliamentarians, to give under the constitution. For what it's worth, there was a possibility that we are saying that, okay, it's a little bit strange that a committee of the House didn't meet and declare a vote of no confidence. But that was not normal times. That
Yes,
that was a nation that's on the brink of collapse.
that's correct.
And so where I see myself within the ambit of the process of what we're saying is the country's salvation, as it were, using the word
Yes.
from the Committee on National Salvation, was where I was, my input into this affair was not simply and only being recognized, for which obviously I had to be treated with some respect for them to think of me as opposed to anybody else. But at the same time, I was able to put in my own part of it, which was to
Yes.
ensure that a company of persons would join me at the Democratic Labour Party to go to Parliament and find some kind of solution.
And that was done, and you were made prime minister sometime, I believe, in the middle of June of 1979,
Right.
and then you were prime minister until the following year, 79 to 80, where there was an election in July of 80. But in August of 79, August 29th of 79, almost 2 months to the date, May, June, July, well, 3 months, August, we had Hurricane David, which was the biggest disaster of the last century, and you were prime minister, and you were able to pull together some resources, handle that pretty well. How did you think you did as prime minister at that time?
I think I would just respond by saying that the people who experience it, I meet on my walk of life in various parts of the world, and everyone that I spoke to have indicated some experience of positivity. The energy was good. The distribution of what came through for the benefits of the people were properly distributed, and
Let
there
me
was
just take a
nobody.
moment, sir. I don't want you to go any further. Let me just take a moment. As being someone who was a founding member of the Democratic Labour Party, I was in fact in Goodwill in Pottersville, Eustace Francis's agent. I was there when the Cubans came and provided scholarships at Springfield with Morris Bishop and yourself. I was right there. Hudson Austin was there. You may not have known that, but the Hudson Austin was there. I want to commend you, sir. I want to, on behalf of my family and all the Dominicans at that time, for having had you as prime minister. You were honest. You did not see maladministration or theft on a massive scale or diversion on a massive scale of the proceeds of the assistance. People were fed. In fact, there were people who were so well fed they put on weight that they've not lost till this day. And so, it was a tough time, but I just want to say, Prime Minister Seraphine, you did a wonderful job. Now, uh, others can defer on that. In fact, that was the beginning. of the Cuban scholarship program under your administration.
Well, I thank you very, very much for your contribution on this particular matter, because, I would like to just put a closure on this aspect of my emergence as Prime Minister, because I didn't ask for the job. I was not part of it. I was on my way to the countryside. I was at a place called Venus in Bells with my family on my way out. As to what my next plan was, I realized I had left a cabinet of which there were 16 members. And I didn't expect a fall in 2 days, mark you. I would have to be prescient. I would have to have a certain kind of thinking to know that this thing took place on 20th of May, and the 2nd of June, when I gave my resignation, for me to have known that the government was going to fall was actually impossible for me to anticipate that. So I didn't live with intent to be anything else. Having said that, when people refer to Eugenia Charles and say that she could have been and she gave you a break, no such thing, because the reality is that she only had 4 members or thereabout in the Parliament of Dominica. There's no way in which she could have emerged and have got the supporters of party, including your uncle and others, to come and give her support, having removed Patrick John by the Cool Wash Brigade, by the throwing of stones, and for the general comportment of the masses. So
as you
that,
know, if you can stick a pin, I interviewed Eugenia Charles right here in the same room, almost 30 years ago, 1996, 28 years ago, and she said that she was offered the opportunity but rejected it because she felt the Labour Party had won the election and they must serve out the remainder of their term. That was her response to me. But go ahead.
But the reality is that there's no way that she would have got the 11 or 12 that she'd have needed, because the Labour Party
did not have the
never,
elected members. She
no,
didn't have the
Labour
numbers.
Party members would never have given her support, bearing in mind the history of, the
antagonism
behavior
and so on.
and antagonisms and so on. So, okay, so I then became Prime Minister as a result of that. I stayed there for a year and a month, June to July.
Yeah.
And since then, there were others who came in. Rosie was there for 9 months. Pierre Charles was a minister of government, and he became Prime Minister for 4 years. Edison James was the same thing, 4 years, and so on. So a lot of people, including my children, who said to me, but they always talk about you as if you were just a short time. I said, well, what is short time compared to the other types of others? And in fact, Pierre Charles became Prime Minister from the cabinet, from the Parliament. And so did Roosevelt Skerritt on his first term after the death of Rosie.
Yes.
So fair and balance is to say that we all gave our service. And in fact, I keep on reminding those who are close to me that here is a situation where in 70 I went up for council election, chairman of the Central Housing and Planning Authority, 75 minister, 80 I out of office. But a lot of people forget that there is another aspect of the whole thing. In 1979, end of 79, and you, as a historian, may have forgotten that, there was a change of the guards. I had said that the CNS people were removed by the winds of Hurricane David.
That's when you removed Maynard and
Arlene and of course Afimate. So it turns out that when that transpired, a new government came in. People like Robinson came in, and the Carib chief came in as senators, as well as even Papi Baptist came in as a senator. And a new government was formed. And I remember speaking at the House of Assembly, and if you check the answer, they'll bear me out. I said that the Labour Party is like a hydra-headed, that when you cut off one head, the other one grows. So there was a Labour Party at the end of that year that came back into government.
Yes.
And people seem to, for whatever reason, that doesn't seem to have really registered with them. Similar to the fact that when I became Prime Minister, I had an arrangement with the Iranian government. And you had a newspaper article from the United States was transported to Dominica on on citizenship for sale, passport for sale. $10,000 on the Chronicle front page.
Yes.
And yet today you have historians and you have people saying, well, the first economic citizenship program began with Virginia Charles. Not so. It began with that program.
Yes, yes. So
With
you're
the
saying
Iranian
you're the
program.
first prime minister to begin the issue of selling passports. Is that what you're saying?
Well, basically, no. I was the first prime minister who started the process of having an economic citizenship program, not
I
passport
see.
for sale. The
It's
concept
different because
was,
these are
it's
two different
different.
things.
There's a different thing because when the Iranians came down, they signed a contract and an agreement, an MOU, that those who would arrive would invest with no less than $1 million within the first months of their arrival in Dominica.
Yeah.
And that there be $10,000 which put up as an escrow to determine whether they qualify
Yes.
for,
Yes.
for citizenship. It doesn't have
So
money
these
to
are
do.
people who are fleeing the revolution that overthrew the
Precisely.
Shah of
He's
Iran.
coming back of the Shah of Iran to Syria. And of course, the Americans having their concerns with the
Yes.
444 days of the persons who were held hostage. And so we were in the international community, you know.
Yes,
Just
yes. Well, in fact, the Labour Party was said, the Dem Lab was said to have the Shah's money. And I remember Eustace Francis says, of course, we have no Shah money. This is political humbug. That was his word. Those were his words. And you know how
don't
Eustace spoke,
don't like Eustace, yeah.
Eustace says, they say that we have the Shah's money. We don't have Shah's money. This is political humbug. He spoke very slow,
Yeah, he's very, very slow. You have him, you covered him, you have him very well. Very well
He
put.
also said right around.
I just wanted to input this because it's part of the whole process of understanding our politics
Yes,
at a
yes,
different
indeed.
level than what is being put across to as truth. Because you have
Yes.
mistruth, you have miscalculation of facts, you have all kinds of things.
How do you compare this passport sales program that's going on now with the economic development project that you engaged with the Iranians back in 1979-80?
The one that was we engaged with the Iranians in 1980 was based upon a factual situation whereby under United Nations law, we had a right to give refugee status and so on to people who are fleeing from political harm. And we accept them on that principle. They agreed that as a result of that friendship, that they would invest at least $1 million at the minimum within the first 6 months of their arrival in order after paperwork would have been achieved and accomplished and so on. And then the $10,000 was to ensure that we didn't get crooks and criminals. We could do due inquiry, due diligence, and make sure that. In fact, there was an area at Penrice or the area by Venus up in that Bells area with a lot of lands abundant where we said we could have done a city with them coming in.
Mhm.
And I believe I had a conversation, if I could use his name, Louis Robbins, and I spoke about it last week, and he recognized that that was in fact the way we were going forward. What we
Yes.
wanted really was to create and establish an opportunity for the people of arrivals to Dominica contribute to the society by creating jobs for the
Yes.
people of Dominica,
Yes.
for the people of Dominica.
Yeah,
And
not
that
for
was
themselves or to build a house in Dubai.
no, that
Okay.
was for the people of Dominica. And
Let's
so,
let's let's because I know time draweth nigh. This has been a wonderful interview. We're coming to July of 79. The elections are on. I remember the helicopter that you flew from different constituencies. It's never been done before. I remember the blimp, Vote Demlab blimp, that was towed by the trawler that was donated to the PIC, that's the Popular Independence Committee by Burnham. How did the election turn out the way it did? I mean, there were people who say that, of course, when you went to Grenada, and there was a Grenada declaration when you said, long live the revolution, that you were taking a leftward tack, but then there are others who say that you fell under the influence of Sally Shelton, the US ambassador, and you then said, well, Dominica should be used as a US base for submarine warfare and that type of thing. So there's a lot of, back and forth. The Cold War was on. You had to play the politics of the day very carefully. How do you believe you handled that election, and how do you believe you handled the relationship with the Grenada Revolution vis-a-vis Sally Shelton in the United States?
you're asking a very in-depth question, very in-depth. You're asking a very in-depth question. And it starts off by saying that I chose to work for the people, to create that international effort without sticking on the ground and doing the campaigns. That's one reason why I lost the election. That's one reason. But the main reason why I lost is because Eugenia Charles Freedom Party, as you said, had become popular in the Roseau Basin area. But more than that, the alliance that had a powerful group of very eloquent, young, dynamic speakers decided to contest that election, which I thought was
Stick a pin
unfortunate.
in there, stick a pin in there. So I want the record to reflect that the political left, that is the Black Power movement, the people who on the political left, the people who believed in socialism beyond the Labour Party version of socialism, the Labour Party was a social democratic organization with a focus on democracy. The new left of the 1970s believed more in the Marxist approach and the revolutionary approach that was for a Christian, majority Christian, anti-communist country was anathema to a lot of the older generation who had been brought up in Christian virtue and that type of thing. So when the election was upon us, there was a split. The folks in the left who were with the Popular Independence Committee and Michael Douglas Democratic Alliance all joined DemLab, to include myself. And there are others who were like Bernard Wilshire, Pierre Charles, I think Francisco Esprit, Arthur Mate, Ron Green. They continued on with the Dominica Liberation Movement, which, by the way, had been named by Rosie Douglas following the funeral of Timothy. Philip Timothy was buried on the 30th. He died on the 29th, was buried the next day. In those days, we had no mortuary or we had no funeral home that could maintain the body. So you had to be buried within 24 hours. So he was buried the next day. That evening, there was a meeting at the church council of all the left-wing forces, and Rosie named the Dominican Liberation Movement, which he then, of course, left before the election because the view, I will share with you now, we went to, I'm the last person alive from Dominica at the Grenada Revolution, first anniversary. The other people were Mike Douglas, Rosie Douglas, and Hilarion Deja, who I'm sure you knew very well. They're all gone on to meet their maker. So I'm the last person to tell you that when we asked for assistance from the revolution, they said to us that Arthur and actually Para Rivera, deceased, had said that they were concerned that Rosie was a CIA agent and that we should link up with them, we should link up with the DLM, and if we don't link up with the DLM, we'll get no support. And when we left the meeting, it was our decision that we were going to go with DemLab, that DLM on its own could not win, that we had to all come together, that if we had all come together, we had a chance. But as DLM on its own, it was not going to work, that there was just too much of the, after Hurricane David, and the Americans came down and they put the flags up. Remember the flags were all over. I remember when Bishop came, people thought they were coming to sell Dominica to Cuba and all that. The propaganda was just too much. And we felt if we didn't get together, we couldn't win the election. And that's exactly what happened.
Well, precisely so. And, you know, it was very unfortunate in hindsight. I have met one or two persons who know that they could have done better in terms of the relationships and the alliances. But just like you should know, the same way you give me some inside story, let me give you an inside story. There was a moment in time when Patrick John was influenced by one or two persons that were close to both of us to meet and to arrive at an amicable understanding going forward. That was prior to the persons who were removed from the cabinet, like you mentioned, Brian Allen and Charles Payne and so on, and Afi. And when we met at the Spring House at Springfield Guest House, Patrick and myself sat down and agreed on the principle that because I had had a head start in terms of popularity following his demise, that he would give me support on the basis that I remove from my cabinet those persons that he saw as being hostile in a direct way to him. And we agreed, we had a gentleman's shake on it, to the extent that when those persons were removed, following parliamentary meetings, Patrick and his group continued to give me support. As a consequence of that arrangement, because I kept to my end of the bargain, which was to get rid of the infidels that he called the infidels within my
Yes.
cabinet.
Yes.
So we then moving into the end of 79, and Patrick was supposed to have been giving me his unconditional support for the forthcoming general elections. And then we'd have negotiated certain positions that he could take, cabinet positions, maybe presidency, whatever the case may be, we'll negotiate that. That was agreed for me as a possibility. It was expected that Bernard and so on would have influenced the DLM to come along. And so if we had one force of PJ, DLM, and myself against Eugenia, our chances would have improved greatly. Unfortunately, I had these two other situations where DLM went where Patrick then came in because people influenced him and said that he should now come back into the fray, coming from his past historical popularity. Unfortunately, that killed the goose that laid the golden egg. We ended up losing. But mark you, DLM lost a lot of deposits. So did Patrick. We lost a few, but we were the more popular. DEMLAB was the more popular of the
Yes,
three.
it was the
For
second.
that
It was the
particular
second.
election.
It was the second party in way of popularity. Yes.
Precisely. And then what a lot of people have forgotten, and that's where your communication conversation with me is 40 years late. But anyway, it's better late than never.
Better late than never.
The reality for me was this, that in 1980, following that election of 1980, which is one of the important aspects of what we have to look at, how this whole new Labour Party come about, how Labour Party has come about. That's one of the critical things that young people don't understand, even older people don't. Because by 1983, Patrick and myself had arrived at an understanding of bringing together the Labour parties of Patrick and myself, leaving Mike out for the time being and Rosie out for the time being. And we were going to form this unity party, which we did at Londonderry. And what a lot of us historians like yourself and others can't recall easily is the fact that there was that Londonderry conference of the joint
United
party.
Labour Party.
And I emerged as a leader. Patrick became second in an open contest. Then that brings us to 85. So that's another story by itself. But I just want to establish that there was that co-relationship between the Labour parties, which unfortunately we didn't do it in 80. And in 85, then Mike came aboard. Another story.
Yes, indeed. And so here we are now with a Labour Party that has very little relationship philosophically to the Labour Party that we knew back then. Why do you think that was so?
Very simple. Unfortunately, when Rosie accepted the arrangement with the Freedom Party, because there was 9, 10, and 2. 10 Labour, 2 Freedom, 9 UWP. That arrangement was supposed to be one where you needed to have one more person. And for the purpose of this meeting with you, I'll not disclose the details of it, but there was someone who arrived into the Labour Party front, which was Lorraine Barnes. She arrived there, and that would have been enough. Unfortunately, Sir Avren and who else it was came in.
Baron.
And Baron came in, and the picture changed because immediately after their arrival, here we see Charles Maynard, Harry Bellot, Sorrento, you name it, this guy from John Charles. You just see a group of persons from the Freedom Party leadership taking over the government of post-2000. The Freedom Party became the dominant force in labor. So
that is very true. That is very true.
That's what happened.
Very true. So once Rosie Douglas died, that was it.
That was it. So what you have really is a coalition of permanence, And so what you really facing with is, where is that Labour Party that was supposed to be there is still in askance. Where is the Freedom Party that's supposed to be the opposition is still a question mark. Because they got into such a relationship, strange bedfellows, lying down together and twinning together and producing a child, which is what it is today.
Yes, indeed. Yes, that's a very graphic description that you've given of the type of child that has been born, a child that has, to many people, no conscience, no character, that doesn't reflect the character of the old Freedom Party, doesn't reflect the character of the old Labour Party. It's some sort of foreign imposition, really, when you look at where the money has gone, where the Alien Landholding Act is gone, when you look at the absence of agriculture, where Labour Party was strong, absence of industry. I remember the buy local campaign. We didn't talk about that, but the buy local campaign was a big, big factor in the early success of Patrick John's administration in 1974, 1978, that period where you had Social Security, you had the National Bank, you had the housing estates, and you had the buy local campaign. In fact, people like Sheridan Gregoire and Norris Prevost were involved in a very successful fair on the grounds of the St. Martin School. I remember that fair very well.
Yeah, very true. But again, you being one that grew up with Rosie on his return to Dominica. I will tell you something. I don't know if you're aware of it. In 1995, when Rosie became leader of the party, he sought to get assistance for, although he had had certain relationship with Gaddafi and all of that and certain resources. You and I know that as soon as Rosie comes in from his trip abroad with whatever he has, he distributes it and he becomes la main bala, that is without anything in a short space of time.
Yes, yes, unfortunately.
Towards the election date of 1995, he approached me on the basis of assistance that he knew I had relationships with the French, which I declare I had. And so my sources were informed, and funds were made available through a gentleman who arrived in Dominica and made a contribution of a check, which couldn't be cashed in Dominica. And with Julian Giro then went to Antigua and got one of the Syrian persons of high knowledge in that country of affluence, who changed that check. I think it is about 100,000 US or 80,000 US around there, which was then made available back to Rosie so he could be able to help people, because he was at that point desperate because the people who were in his campaign were asking for assistance and he was not getting that kind of funding locally. And so we arranged it. Following that, however, he kept the relationship. And people like Nanton and people like Nathan Barnes and people like Washway and so on are aware that he used to visit me regularly. In fact, my children used to call him pumpkin soup, because every time he comes from the airport, he stops by, and what he takes is a pumpkin soup.
Yes, yes.
So they come and tell me, Daddy, pumpkin soup is downstairs.
Oh,
and
boy.
wherever I am, I'd come down and meet pumpkin soup, which is Rosie.
Yes, yes.
When the elections of 2000 came about, there was that opportunity also for another level of contribution. And I remember the first meeting that took place at Fort Young was supported by a resource person who was involved with me as a potential client of Dominica, who purchased property on Dominica, who made a contribution to take care of that. Also, to make funds available to the party office of Pierre Charles and Afi Martin, whereby funds were made available for the Texaco companies to be able to issue coupons to those drivers to pick up gas in those areas. So he got some support from me. When he became prime minister, the weekend before, his brother Washway would agree with that I did say to him that he needed to have a cabinet in place, because the elections is Monday, Tuesday, he must have a cabinet. He told me, go ahead and get it done. You know about those things, which I did. I went to Ali Lazar and I got the cabinet prepared for Rosie. And I would say 90% of what I gave him was what he used for his cabinet, except for the Speaker of the House and the Attorney General. He chose those two, and I think other minister or the other, he changed around. But that was the kind of confidence he had with me.
In you.
Yes. And then he promised me to be made the ambassador to the OAS and possibly Washington itself.
I know that because I was told that by no less a person than Erwin LaRoque.
Oh, there we go. Well, I'm happy you're saying that. And there was a certain gentleman who have a business in the north, and I wouldn't like to mention his name, but he has a business in the north, who is one of those persons who work with the present government, who was offered the first secretary position, a close mate of Rosie. Unfortunately, Rosie passed away very early, and that matter was never resolved or taken care of. But I didn't need that from anyone per se. I was doing it to contribute in the way I thought would be useful, because I built up a special relationship with the OAS in particular, because the Secretary General of the OAS happened to have been one that I assisted by engaging me, where there's a Val Macomi on record who became the Deputy Secretary General. And the Secretary General at the time wanted a re-election, and he asked me if I could lobby the Caribbean leaders for him to be reappointed, because he had the South American group. He'd be very happy to present Val Macomi with the opportunity, with the support of the South American group. And guess what? That happened, and he became replaced. He get back into the position of the Secretary General's position, and Val Macomi became the Deputy Secretary General. Through that arrangement, there was arrangements made to set up a indigenous Carib program for the indigenous people, because of the fact of the closeness of the race factor with the South Americans in the OS, and that there would have been, I think Hadid was his name? Not Hadid. I'll remember the name in a short while. However, the arrangement was made that they would have assisted the indigenous people to set up a foundation by which assistance would be given, both by way of education, scholarships, development programs, and so forth.
And that, by the way, that's still needed to this day, and that's still needed.
Yeah, and then and you live in the area, you would know that persons who were made ambassadors to the OS failed in their mission.
Oh, I mean, no, not just ambassadors. OS, we've not had an ambassador to the United States for quite some time of any substance, to be frank with you. I mean, I'll just be honest. I mean, it's just been a waste of time and waste of money. No disrespect to anyone, but that's just the reality of it. But Mr. Prime Minister, we've now gotten to a place where I want to wrap up and ask you to look back in a few words, tell me about your legacy, what you consider to be the high point or the biggest contribution you've made to Dominica.
I would say my legacy is based upon the most important thing. If not me, then 29th of May 79, then who? What I did was, by accepting the responsibility, by becoming some kind of animal within the constitutional process by which I emerged as Prime Minister, gave us the opportunity to allow for the emergence of a democratically elected government in 1980.
So you're saying to me, and I wouldn't use the word animal because that may be a mischaracterization, you became the catalyst for the stabilization of a state that was in crisis by stepping forward, because when you were offered the opportunity, you could have said that it was too heavy a burden. But by accepting the burden of leadership, you stabilized the country, and you were able to deliver in 1980 free and fair elections, and Dominica then was able to continue on. And I want to thank you for that, because it is true that you could have tried to use your office to hang on to power, as some people do. In Haiti, we see today Haiti is falling apart because people have decided to hang on, way beyond
Let me just
reasonable
cut you
time.
short. Let me cut you short on that. That really transpired, you know. I was at the Hummingbird Inn the night of the elections, and I was met, or people came to me, including the person who was killed or hung, Newton, Benjamin who was shot in Roseau, who happened to be from Cochrane, and they came to me with another officer whose name I wouldn't mention right now because I think he's maybe still alive. I don't think it's fair to him, who arrived at Mohammed Berlin and said that it is their desire that I hold on to, to power, for the reason being that we don't have enough time to get the country back to normal coming out of the hurricane of 1979. And the army was prepared to stand by me and to continue to allow my being prime minister for an extended period until such time as I felt that I had enough boots on the ground to create a favorable election. And I informed them that it's under no condition would I put myself and my family into a situation of constant war, because there are persons who would not accept that, and that the country would be in a total level of anarchy and confusion. And I refuse to act. So I consider that as being part of my legacy,
Yeah,
critical part of my legacy.
yeah.
And also, what you as an army person should know is that my fear of what was I'm up against was a defense force to the largest extent loyal to Patrick John, and a police department loyal to Eugenia Charles. And I formed with Ronnie Roberts an organization called the um,
Civil defense.
Civil Defense Unit. Oh, you know about it. And that was my protection. And Civil Defense Unit was involved with many things, including moving a hospital to the bank and to burying bodies and all kinds of things. At the same time, give me some protection.
And it also included the late Sergeant Major of the cadets who just died, Dinsley Lawrence.
Absolutely. Well, you're well informed, my boy. And my sister was there as well,
Yes.
Joseph, and other young ladies were involved. And so that I had to use this as a source of protection for myself and my family.
Let
We
the
were
record
challenged.
reflect that Ronnie Roberts was actually arrested along with other Defense Force members in 1981, around the time of Operation Red Dog, because they thought he was part of that plot, but he was never convicted of any crime.
Very correct and very true. In fact,
Where's
Ronnie
Ronnie right
Roberts,
now, by the way?
he is somewhere in Florida.
Okay.
He may have passed away. I'm not sure, but he was somewhere in Florida.
No, but
I'm
this was
saying
a
so to,
very dynamic
well,
time
I'm saying
because
so to say this, that my life was on the line, and people take this for granted. That at one time my wife was at Springfield, and the defense force person was out there, simply said, OJ is a wanted man. And when Lily went out there to check this person, she shouted at the person, dead or alive, and the person didn't respond. And she called on Major Newton to come and remove those people from our premises. We
yes,
had a
yes,
visitation of someone who arrived in my drawing room and was looking at my books, a white individual, and I have some knowledge of what transpired. It will take a long time to explain. But I was at the mercies of possible mercenaries and different situations.
yes,
So
yes,
that
yes,
is legacy for me, putting my life
yes,
on
yes.
the line for a country for the largest extent I've never respected. I remember going to Scarrett's office one day, and Scarrett said to my wife and I, oh, by the way, OJ, you ever got an honor? You ever got an award? I said, no, not really. He said, but it's true with this man. That's nonsense. I'll deal with this. That was maybe 4 or 5 years ago.
Well, we'll leave it at that. I want to
Right.
let you know that I met Charlie Shelton not too long ago, about 5 years ago, right before COVID. And she remembers Dominica. She remembers you. She said something interesting. She said all of the area around Haiti, Dominica, the Caribbean is sitting on a bed of oil. And that she's talking as a former wife of the deceased Central Intelligence Agency director, DCI, William Colby. And of course, back in the day, you were said to have a very good relationship with Charlie Shelton. was then ambassador of the United States to Dominica. Any comment on that relationship?
Well, I did have a relationship with Theodore Britton, who was just before her. And I used to party at Theodore Britton's place as well. And when she came in, I was introduced to her. So I had a very good relationship with the US. And they created the Basic Human Needs Program, which recreated the cultural center of the old museum of the old what do you call it?
Old meal.
The old mill on the BHN and several other projects. She continues even up to today. She assisted me with the OJ dollar program, which is the pass with the amount of work done will be paid for by the OJ dollar, which is food coupons. And it says not to be exchanged except for relief goods. And then I could go on and on. We probably need another 2 hours. We'll do it
Yes.
again some other time.
But just so the record will reflect, people said it was the OJ dollar. It really wasn't the OJ dollar. We still had the EC dollar, but it was a coupon that persons doing relief work would be paid, not in cash, but in relief supplies. That was a very good initiative. And nobody else, I don't believe, has done anything similar, because I do believe people should learn to work for what they eat. I don't think you should be given anything free. Unless, of course, you just can't work.
Precisely. It's a simple strategy. And even for the buildings, we could have done self-help housing, as
Yes.
was Baron did in the early days. And
Yes.
persons could do the same kind of houses with the modification.
It's called sweat
improvement.
equity, OJ. Sweat equity. That's what it's called.
Sweat equity, absolutely. So we had opportunities lost, but don't forget what you have been able to reestablish and confirm makes me feel that my work in my country wasn't wasted. At least one person seemed to remember. And that's
Not at all. Not at all. Mr. Prime Minister, I just want to thank you for your service, sir. God has blessed you with a good wife. Tell us about your wife. How many years of marriage?
We've been married for 45 years, known her for 50 years. And I wouldn't say what age that I met her, because that could be, if you're a lawyer, you'd appreciate that I could be led into a direction that I wouldn't like to be.
Well, here in the United States, they'd say you take the fifth. That means, you.
I plead the fifth, yeah. As to when we met, but that was a pretty young one.
But give us
she's been
give
a
us the
blessing.
full name and give us a maiden name.
She's Virginia Lily Rabes Seraphine now.
Okay, so she's a Rabes from the Carib territory, Greg Rabes.
Yeah, she's mixed up. She has Carib, she has Chinese, she has black, and white as well. White from the Rabeses that came in from the French islands.
Yes, well, I'll take the I'm not sure about the Chinese, but I'll take the Carib and the French. But are your children, brother OJ?
Yeah, I have 5 children with my wife, but
yes,
because it's going public, I'll still claim that I have 6 others as well.
Okay, but give us the names you don't mind.
Well, within my family is Kinte, Lufa, Joel, Joanne, and Shari. And out there, I have Michael, Leroy, Teddy, Kenrick, Cheryl, and Imani. They are living in diverse places: Canada, US, France, England.
So we're talking 9.
11. 5 at home and 6 out.
Before I have Kinte, Luther, Joel, Sherry,
Joanne and Shari.
Okay. Shari, Michael, Leroy, Teddy, Sherry, and Imani. Kenrick, yes.
Kenrick, Teddy.
And
all
Imani.
of whom are doing well in their own various pursuits.
Well, I want to also compliment Miss Seraphine, because behind every good man is an even greater woman. And I want to thank her for her hospitality to me back when I came to visit you at your nice establishment there. Floral Gardens.
You mean Floral Gardens, yeah.
Floral Gardens. And, I didn't have any of the pumpkin soup, but I'm sure it was quite palatable and quite enjoyable. So she took
She took full responsibility for the daily management. We got international awards, we received local awards, and our award from the government is still in a waiting list for the repayments in total for the
Yes,
demolition of the property. And as
yes.
an attorney, I didn't know you practicing in Dominica. Maybe I could have come to you earlier, but
Unfortunately, I don't have a local license, but I'm hoping that you got effective counsel. We also have a claim on the Layu project, but
yeah,
I wish you all the best with that. I wish you continued health. I wish you and your wife that you make 100, at least you get within striking distance of a century. And again, I just want to reiterate the appreciation. You may not have gotten the accolades of the establishment, but your accolades are well established in the hearts of all people. And for that, I give great thanks. And ask God's blessings on you as you go, as we all go for the spiritual revival. And as we all pray for our country, I ask you for some final words for the young people of Dominica, for the future of our country, and what you'd like to see.
we have a dream, as Martin Luther King would say, and that dream is to be able to produce within our resources and capacities in our own country without having to be in somebody else's country. We would like to think that there are many areas that we could develop, and we could think of alternative energy, appropriate technology, herbal and alternative medicine, small island state climate change, clean renewable energy, affordable renewable energy, food security, research development and investment, carbon pollution and economic potential response mechanism to natural disasters, tourism and real estate development, transportation, air and sea, horticulture, aquaculture, sea fisheries programs, environmental business, climate change policies, greenhouse gas emission protection, innovative emission, rainforest and land protection, protection of the rainforest and land, public and private sector partnerships, water conservation and river protection, energy efficiency, poverty alleviation, humanitarian fund, material development projects, ferry and cargo, and green-oriented tourism. These are some ideas I'm throwing out for the youth. Pick one of
Great.
them and work towards receiving it.
But all of those ideas, as good as they are, you said a few things that had to do with character evolution, character formation. Speak to that because you have been able to observe the youth of your generation, my time, and what's there now. What within their character formation you believe needs to change so we can achieve some of the objectives that you recited a moment ago?
The first is the acceptance that there's a creator and there's a man called Jesus Christ. He alone can make a way for us if we call upon him. He's the owner, controller, and dominant face of the entire planet. And that which you seek through him with honesty and with faith can bear fruit. First of all, love thy neighbor as thyself. That is the key, love. Forgive those who cause you pain, because that's where you remove from you the problem, the albatross that brings you down. Seek that which you want and demand that which you wish to have, but from a position of integrity and protection of your own scruples. Let not no man cause you to be subjected to your knees or on a bed. Accepting that, whether you be male or female, is the beginning of the end for you as a person. Young people should therefore seek deep conscious knowledge of that which they're aspiring for, that which you believe is available in the universe is available to you. The same way that there are doctors and lawyers that have left our shores as children of immigrants in England in the earlier days, and of children of those of us who left our shores of Dominica, and those of us who were able to get education in Dominica and continue to seek that which we want. It's available to us all once we decide to stay focused and to accept that we do not have to buy what is being told to us by another man, because man falls short of the glory of God. And may God bless all Dominican children, and may they have peace. Love thy neighbor, but more importantly, love and respect your parents. For the first law of the Bible that is so clear in commandments is that respect and love thy parents and honor thy parents, so it shall be good with you. And he promised that all shall be well once you do this, and you will be given long life. That's the only promise that God has made.
Yeah.
Long
Honor
life.
thy father and thy mother, and thy days shall be long.
That's right. You got
That
it.
is, Brother OJ, I just want
Nice
to
talking
thank
to
you.
you.
God bless you. I want to say that I will transcribe that, which you've done, but I will send you the recording once it's prepared, okay? God bless
No
you and the
problem at all.
family. Thank you
I
for
did
all you've
some
done for us.
research. I did some research. Unfortunately, you've carried me through that I didn't have to go through it.